Chapter 1. The windmill's whisperth train rattled through the patchwork of English countryside. Its wheels humming a steady rhythm against the tracks, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, a delicate counterpoint to the engine's drone. Her eyes, bright and sharp despite her years, traced the rolling hills of St. Mary's Hollow, where hedgerows stitched fields into a quilt of green and gold. She adjusted her spectacles, not because she needed to see better, but because it gave her a moment to think. The letter in her handbag, penned in the looping script of her old friend Clara Henshaw, had been insistent. "Come to the windmill, Jane. Something's not right." Clara wasn't prone to hysterics, a widow with a penchant for gardening and a mind as orderly as her rose beds. She had a knack for noticing when things were out of place, be it a wilting petal or a village secret. Her letter had described the old windmill, recently converted into a guest house by a newcomer named Tobias Finch, as a place of unease. Guests came and went, but Clara swore she'd seen figures moving in the shadows at night, heard whispers of deals struck in the small hours. "It's not just gossip, Jane," she'd written. "There's a deception here, and I need your eyes." Miss Marple folded her knitting and tucked it into her tapestry bag. The train slowed, puffing steam as it approached St. Mary's Hollow station. She stepped onto the platform, her sensible shoes tapping against the weathered boards, and inhaled the crisp air, laced with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke. Clara waited by a rickety cart, her face creased with both relief and worry. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes," Clara said, embracing her. "I half expected you to send a polite refusal." "Nonsense, Clara," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but firm. "When an old friend calls, one answers. Besides, I've always wanted to see a windmill up close." Clara chuckled, though her eyes darted toward the hill where the windmill stood, its sails cutting lazy arcs against the sky. "It's a beauty, I'll grant you. But there's something off about it. You'll see." They climbed into the cart, drawn by a placid pony named Thistle, and trundled toward the village. St. Mary's Hollow unfolded around them, thatched cottages with ivy-clad walls, a stone church with a lopsided steeple, and a pub called the Rusty Plough, where locals lingered over pints. The windmill loomed ahead, its stone base weathered but sturdy, its wooden sails creaking in the breeze. Ivy clung to its walls, and a new sign proclaimed it Finch's Folly Guest House. "Tobias Finch bought it last year," Clara explained as they approached. "Said he wanted to preserve history, but he's turned it into a fancy place for city folk. Charges a fortune, too, the locals grumble, but he's got charm enough to smooth it over." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already cataloging details. A charming newcomer with money to spend often meant a past worth hiding. "And the guests?" she asked. "A mixed lot," Clara said. "There's Colonel Hargrove, retired, always talking about his army days. Emily Wells, a young artist who sketches everything, and Mrs. Lavinia Gray, a widow who keeps to herself. Others come and go, but those three have been here a fortnight." They reached the windmill, and Clara helped Miss Marple down. The guest-house door swung open, revealing Tobias Finch himself. He was a weary man in his late 40s, with a mop of chestnut hair and eyes that twinkled with practiced warmth. His tweed jacket was impeccably tailored, a touch to find for a village innkeeper. "Mrs. Henshaw, you've brought a guest," Tobias exclaimed, his voice smooth as polished oak. "And this must be the famous Miss Marple. Welcome to Finch's Folly." Miss Marple smiled, her expression mild but her gaze keen. "You're too kind, Mr. Finch. It's a charming place, quite distinctive." Tobias laughed, ushering them inside. The interior was a blend of rustic and refined, exposed stone. Walls met polished oak floors, and a spiral staircase wound up to the guest rooms. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across a tapestry depicting windmills in a storm. Miss Marple noted the modern chandelier, an odd contrast to the ancient beams overhead. "Tea," Tobias offered, gesturing to a table set with a porcelain service. "I'll have Mrs. Pym bring it up. She's my housekeeper." Though she's more village gossip than employee, Clara raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Miss Marple accepted the offer, settling into a cushioned chair as Tobias disappeared to fetch the housekeeper. Clara leaned close. "He's always like that, charming, but slippery. I don't trust him. Patience, Clara. Miss Marple murmured. Charm is often a mask, but it's rarely perfect. We'll see what slips through. The other guests began to gather in the common room. Colonel Hargrove entered first, a barrel-chested man with a bristling mustache and a limpy attributed to an old war wound. His eyes flicked over Miss Marple with polite curiosity. Before he launched into a story about a campaign in North Africa, she listened, noting how his details shifted slightly with each retelling. As if testing which version landed best, Emily Wells slipped in next, her auburn hair tied back in a loose bun. A sketchbook clutched to her chest. She was young, perhaps 25, with a nervous energy that made her fingers tap against the book's cover. When introduced, she offered a shy smile but avoided eye contact, her gaze drifting to the windmill's rafters. Mrs. Lavinia Gray was last, gliding in with the poise of a woman who'd once turned heads. Her black dress was elegant but severe, and her gray eyes held a guarded intensity. She nodded at Miss Marple, murmuring a greeting before settling near the fire, her hands folded primly in her lap. Mrs. Pym, the housekeeper, bustled in with the tea tray, her round face flushed from the kitchen. Oh, Miss Marple, you're the talk of the village already, she chirped, setting out cups. We don't get many visitors like you. Mind you, this windmill's seen its share of odd folk lately. Odd how? Miss Marple asked, her tone light but probing. Mrs. Pym hesitated, glancing at Tobias, who'd returned to hover nearby. Oh, just folks coming and going at all hours. Nothing proper, if you ask me. Tobias laughed, a touch too loudly. Mrs. Pym loves a story. The windmill's old, so it creaks and groans. Makes people imagine all sorts of nonsense. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning. The housekeeper's comment wasn't nonsense, it was a thread, thin but tangible. She resolved to speak with Mrs. Pym alone later. Dinner was served in the windmill's dining room, a circular space with windows offering views of the darkening hills. The meal was hearty roast lamb, potatoes, and a tart apple crumble, but the conversation was stilted. Colonel Hargrove dominated, recounting a tale of a lost convoy, while Emily pushed food around her plate, and Lavinia stared into her wineglass. Tobias played the perfect host, refilling glasses and deflecting questions about his past with anecdotes about the windmills. Restoration. Miss Marple observed, her silence a tool as sharp as her knitting needles. She noted how Emily's eyes darted to the staircase as if expecting someone to descend. Lavinia's fingers tightened around her glass when Tobias mentioned hidden treasures in the windmill's history, though he passed it off as a joke. The colonel, meanwhile, seemed overly interested in the windmill's foundation, asking about its construction with a specificity that felt rehearsed. After dinner, the guests retired to the common room for coffee. Miss Marple excused herself, claiming fatigue, but lingered in the hallway, her ears attuned to the murmurs beyond the door. She heard Tobias speaking in a low voice to someone. Lavinia. Perhaps their words indistinct but urgent. The ledger's still here, one of them said, the phrase sharp enough to cut through the hum of conversation. We need to move it before. The voices stopped as footsteps approached, and Miss Marple slipped up the staircase, her heart quickening. A ledger. It was no surprise old houses often hid secrets, and a windmill, with its nooks and crannies, was perfect for concealment. But what was it? A record of debts, crimes, or something older, tied to the war the colonel couldn't stop mentioning. Her room was cozy, with a slanted ceiling and a window overlooking the sails, now still in the night air. She sat at the small desk, pulling out her notebook to jot down observations. Tobias polished, evasive. Colonel Hargrove war stories inconsistent. Emily nervous, watching. Lavinia guarded, possibly involved. Ledger key to the mystery. She paused, her pen hovering. The windmill creaked, a low groan that seemed to carry a warning. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She'd heard such whispers before in drawing rooms, in village halls. In the silences people thought safe. They always led somewhere. Clara knocked softly, entering with a shawl draped over her shoulders. Well, Jane, what do you make of it? Miss Marple closed her notebook. It's early days, Clara, but there's something here. A ledger, perhaps, and people circling it like moths around a flame. We'll need to watch closely. Clara nodded, her face set. I knew you'd see it. That windmill's been quiet too long, it's ready to talk." Miss Marple looked out at the sails, their shadows stark against the moonlit sky. "And I'm ready to listen." The night deepened, and the windmill's whispers grew louder, promising secrets yet to unfold. Miss Marple tucked her notebook away, satisfied with the evening's work. A thread had been pulled, and the tapestry of deceit was already beginning to unravel. Chapter 2. Shadows in the sails. The morning sun spilled over St. Mary's Hollow, painting the windmill's stone walls in hues of gold and amber. Miss Jane Marple stood at her window, her eyes tracing the slow turn of the sails against a cloudless sky. The creak of the wooden blades was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. But she was not here to be lulled. The whispered mention of a hidden ledger from the previous night lingered in her mind, a tantalizing clue in a puzzle that was only beginning to take shape. She adjusted her shawl, her fingers brushing the notebook in her pocket, and prepared for the day. Clara had promised a tour of the windmill's inner workings, and Miss Marple intended to see more than just gears and beams. Breakfast was a lively affair in the dining room, with Tobias Finch presiding like a genial lord of the manor. The table groaned under plates of scones, clotted cream, and a steaming pot of tea. But Miss Marple's attention was on the guests. Colonel Hargrove, his mustache bristling, was expounding on the virtues of military discipline to a distracted Emily Wells, who clutched her sketchbook as if it were a shield. Mrs. Lavinia Gray sat apart, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on a point beyond the window. Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in Emily's hand as she reached for her tea, and the way Lavinia's gaze flickered toward Tobias when he mentioned the windmill's history. "The old girl's been standing since the 17th century," Tobias said, spreading jam on a scone with theatrical flair. "Smugglers used it, they say, to signal ships off the coast. All those nooks and crannies perfect for hiding things." His eyes twinkled, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting tension in his smile, as if he'd said more than intended. "Fascinating," she murmured, her tone encouraging. "And you've preserved all that history, Mr. Finch?" "Oh, as much as I could," he replied, waving a hand. "The gears are original, though I've added modern comforts. You'll see on the tour this morning. I insist you all join. Gives you a sense of the place." Emily's teacup clinked against its saucer, and Miss Marple's eyes flicked to her. The young artist's face was pale, her lips pressed tight. Nervous about the tour, or something else, Miss Marple wondered. She made a mental note to stay close to Emily during the exploration. After breakfast, the group gathered at the base of the windmill, where a heavy oak door led to the inner workings. Tobias unlocked it with a flourish, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling upward. The air inside was cool and musty, smelling of old wood and iron. The group, Miss Marple, Clara, Colonel Hargrove, Emily, and Lavinia, followed Tobias, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Mrs. Pym, the housekeeper, trailed behind, muttering about dust and cobwebs. "Mind your step," Tobias called, his voice bouncing off the walls. "These stairs are older than all of us combined." Miss Marple moved carefully, her hand grazing the rough stone for balance. She observed the group. The colonel's limp seemed less pronounced today, as if he were eager to explore. Emily clutched her sketchbook, her eyes darting to every shadow. Lavinia's expression was unreadable, but her fingers twisted a lace handkerchief. Clara, ever practical, carried a small torch, its beam cutting through the dimness. They emerged into a cavernous chamber, where the windmill's gears loomed like the bones of some ancient beast. Massive wooden cogs interlocked, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of use. A shaft connected to the sails outside groaned as it turned, filling the space with a low, rhythmic hum. Sunlight streamed through narrow slits in the walls, casting slanted beams that danced with motes of dust. "Isn't she a marvel?" Tobias said, patting a gear fondly. "This beauty still grinds flour if I let her, though we mostly use her for show now. The real work's in the guest house." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room. The walls were uneven, patched with newer stone in places, and a rusty iron ladder led to a platform above, where the main shaft connected to the sails. She noticed Emily lingering near a corner, her pencil moving rapidly over her sketchbook. The girl's focus was intense, almost feverish, as she traced the outline of a gear with precise, measured strokes. "Miss Wells," Miss Marple said, approaching with a smile. "You've an eye for detail. Are you capturing the windmill's soul?" Emily started, her pencil skidding across the page. "Oh, just the mechanics," she stammered. "My father was an engineer. He loved old machines like this. I suppose I'm drawn to them." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression kind but probing. "A family passion, then. Did he ever visit windmills like this one?" Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening on the sketchbook. "Not this one, no. But he talked about them, said they were full of secrets." "Secrets?" Miss Marple's tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. "What a romantic notion." Emily flushed, closing her sketchbook. "Just a figure of speech," she muttered, turning away. Miss Marple let her go, her mind turning. Emily's sketches weren't mere art, they were purposeful, almost technical. Was she searching for something specific, perhaps tied to her father's stories, the ledger, maybe? She filed the thought away, her attention shifting as Tobias led them to the upper platform. The platform offered a view of the sails through a wide, unglazed window. The breeze carried the scent of grass and distant rain, and the group paused to admire the landscape. Colonel Hargrove leaned against the railing, his eyes scanning the mechanism with a curiosity that seemed more than casual. Lavinia stood apart, her handkerchief now tucked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon, or so it seemed. Miss Marple noticed her steal a glance at a panel in the wall, its edges slightly misaligned, as if it had been recently disturbed. "Careful up here," Tobias said, his voice jovial but strained. "The wind can be fierce. Don't want anyone tumbling off." As if on cue, a gust rattled the sails, and the gears below groaned louder. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and died, plunging the chamber into near darkness. Clara's torch flickered on, its beam cutting through the gloom, but a collective gasp rose from the group. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not from fear but from anticipation. Darkness, she knew, often revealed what light concealed. Blasted wiring. Tobias cursed, fumbling with a switch. This old place, always something breaking. Miss Marple stayed still, her ears straining. Amid the murmurs of the group, she caught a faint sound, a metallic clink, like a tool striking stone, coming from the corner near the misaligned panel. She turned her head, but the darkness hid the source. Emily's breathing was audible, sharp, and uneven, and Miss Marple sensed movement nearby, though she couldn't be sure who it was. The lights snapped back on, revealing the group in disarray. Colonel Hargrove was gripping the railing, his face flushed. Emily stood frozen, her sketchbook pressed to her chest. Lavinia was closer to the panel than before, her expression serene, but her eyes alert. Tobias, flustered, was muttering about calling an electrician. "Nothing to worry about," he said, forcing a laugh. "Just the windmill's quirks. Shall we continue?" Miss Marple smiled, her mind racing. The clink had been deliberate. She was certain a tool, perhaps, probing for something hidden. The panel was the key, and someone in the group knew it. She glanced at Emily, who avoided her gaze, and at Lavinia, whose composure seemed a fraction to perfect. The tour resumed, but Miss Marple lingered near the panel as the others moved on. She ran her fingers along its edge, feeling a slight give, as if it weren't fully secured. She didn't press further, too many eyes were watching, but she memorized its location. Clara, catching her eye, gave a subtle nod, as if sensing her friend's discovery. Back in the common room, the group dispersed, but Miss Marple stayed, sipping tea and watching. Emily retreated to a corner, sketching again, her pencil moving with frantic energy. Colonel Hargrove excused himself, claiming a need for fresh air, but Miss Marple noted his path took him toward the windmill's base. Lavinia murmured something about a headache and slipped upstairs, her steps silent but purposeful. Clara joined Miss Marple by the fire, her voice low. "Well, Jane, did you see anything?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, yes, a panel that doesn't fit, a sound that doesn't belong, and a young woman sketching more than scenery. The windmill's talking, Clara, and I'm beginning to understand its language." Clara frowned. "That blackout, do you think it was planned?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said. "Or someone took advantage of it. Either way, we've a thread to pull." Keep an eye on Emily, will you? She's searching for something. And I suspect it's more than inspiration." As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple sat with her notebook, jotting down her observations, panel possible hiding place, clink tool, deliberate, Emily sketching gears, nervous, Lavinia near panel during blackout, Colonel too curious about structure, Tobias deflecting. She closed the book, satisfied with the day's progress. The windmill's shadows were lengthening, and with them, the outlines of a deception were coming into focus. Chapter 3. The Colonel's Talith windmill stood sentinel over St. Mary's Hollow, its sails slicing through the morning mist like a clock counting secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her hands folded around a teacup, her eyes flitting between the guests with the quiet alertness of a cat watching sparrows. The previous day's tour had sharpened her instincts, the metallic clink in the darkness, Emily's feverish sketching, Lavinia's proximity to the misaligned panel, and Tobias Finch's too smooth deflection of questions all pointed to a puzzle with the ledger at its heart. But it was Colonel Hargrove, with his blustering tales and keen interest in the windmill's structure, who drew her attention today. The dining room was warm with the scent of fresh-baked bread and kippers, but the atmosphere was taut. Tobias, ever the convivial host, poured coffee with a flourish, his chatter about the weather a thin veil over the tension. Emily picked at her plate, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, while Lavinia sipped tea with a detachment that seemed practiced. Colonel Hargrove, however, was in fine form, his voice booming as he launched into a story about a desert campaign in the war. It was 43. "You see," he said, leaning forward, his mustache quivering with enthusiasm, "we were pinned down near El Alamein, sand in our boots, sun like a furnace. My unit had to guard a supply cache gold, they said, for the war effort. Never saw it myself, mind you, but the rumors." He trailed off, his eyes flicking to Tobias, who was busy refilling a jug. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite interest. "Gold, Colonel? How extraordinary. And what became of it?" Hargrove blinked, as if caught off guard, then chuckled. "Lost, most likely. War's a messy business, Miss Marple. Things vanish, gold, men, promises." He took a bite of kipper, but his jaw worked too quickly, betraying a flicker of unease. She nodded, her smile benign, but her mind sharp. The Colonel's stories had a rehearsed quality, like lines from a play he'd performed too often. Yesterday, he'd mentioned a convoy in Tunisia. Now it was El Alamein. The details shifted, but the theme of hidden wealth persisted. Was he probing, testing the room for reactions? And why his interest in the windmill's foundation during the tour? She sipped her tea, filing away the inconsistency. Clara, seated beside her, leaned close. "He's at it again," she whispered. "Always the war stories, but they never quite add up." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "A man who tells the same story twice rarely tells it the same way. Let's see where his tales lead today." After breakfast, Tobias announced a village market day, suggesting the guests explore St. Mary's Hollow. "Fresh produce, local crafts," he said, his grin wide. "You'll see the heart of the place." "I'll be here, minding the windmill." Miss Marple sensed an opportunity. The market would scatter the guests, giving her a chance to observe them in a new setting and perhaps to investigate the windmill undisturbed. She agreed to join, but her eyes lingered on Colonel Hargrove, who was already pulling on his coat, his limp more pronounced as he moved toward the door. The market sprawled across the village green, a lively patchwork of stalls selling everything from homemade jams to hand-carved walking sticks. The air buzzed with chatter, the clink of coins, and the occasional bleat of a goat from a livestock pen. Miss Marple strolled arm in arm with Clara, her hat tilted against the sun, her gaze sweeping the crowd. Emily was at a stall examining pottery, her sketchbook tucked away but her fingers twitching as if longing to draw. Lavinia drifted toward a bookseller, her gloved hands flipping through old volumes with a focus that seemed more than casual. Colonel Hargrove, however, was nowhere in sight. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Clara, did you see where the Colonel went?" Clara scanned the green. "He was here a moment ago, talking to old Mr. Tate about cider. Then he just vanished." Miss Marple's lips pursed. A man with a limp didn't vanish in a bustling market unless he meant to. She excused herself, murmuring about needing a rest, and made her way back toward the windmill, her steps brisk but unhurried. The hill was quiet, the market's noise fading behind her, replaced by the windmill's rhythmic creak. As she approached, she spotted a figure near the base, a familiar broad-shouldered silhouette in a tweed cap. Colonel Hargrove was crouched by the windmill's foundation, his hands brushing over the stones as if searching for something. His limp seemed forgotten, his movements agile and deliberate. Miss Marple slipped behind a hedgerow, her heart quickening. She watched as he pressed a stone, then another, his fingers probing for give. He muttered to himself, words lost in the breeze, but his frustration was clear. She stepped forward, her voice soft but clear, admiring the architecture. Colonel Hargrove started, nearly toppling backward. His face reddened, but he recovered. With a laugh, "Miss Marple, you move like a ghost." "Yes, just fascinated by these old stones. Solid work, you know, built to last." "Indeed," she said, her eyes twinkling, "though it seems you're looking for something specific." "A loose stone," perhaps. His smile faltered, but he rallied. "Just curiosity, my dear lady. Old habits from the war, always checking for weak points." She nodded, letting the moment pass. "Of course. Shall we return to the market?" "I believe Clara's found some excellent preserves," Hargrove agreed, his relief palpable. And they walked back together. Miss Marple kept her pace slow, allowing him to lead, her mind turning over his actions. The foundation was no random interest, it tied to his stories of lost wartime wealth. Was the ledger a record of that gold he'd mentioned? And if so, why was he searching alone? Back at the market, Miss Marple rejoined Clara, who was haggling over a jar of gooseberry jam. "Well," Clara whispered. "Find anything?" A colonel with a selective limp, Miss Marple replied softly, "and a keen interest in the windmill's stones. We'll need to watch him closely tonight." The afternoon passed in a blur of village charm, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She bought a small basket of apples, more to blend in. Then, out of need, and used the time to observe, Emily had bought a clay pendant, its shape oddly reminiscent of a gear, and Lavinia had purchased a book on local history, her expression unreadable. Tobias appeared briefly, charming stallholders with his easy grin, but his eyes scanned the crowd as if searching for someone. Dinner that evening was a quieter affair, the market's excitement leaving the guests subdued. Colonel Hargrove was jovial, regaling them with a new tale about a midnight raid in the war. But Miss Marple noted his eyes darting to the windows, as if expecting an interruption. Emily excused herself early, claiming a headache, and Lavinia followed soon after, her steps silent on the stairs. Tobias lingered, offering brandy, but Miss Marple declined, citing a need for fresh air. Outside, the windmill loomed against a sky streaked with twilight. She strolled toward the base, her torch casting a thin beam. The stones Hargrove had examined were unremarkable at a glance, but one caught her eye. A faint scratch marked its surface, fresh and deliberate. She knelt, her fingers tracing the edge, and felt a slight give. Not enough to open, but enough to confirm her suspicion. Something was hidden here, and the colonel knew it. She returned to the guest house, her mind alight with possibilities. The ledger, the gold, the windmill's secrets, they were connected, and Hargrove was a key player. But was he the only one? Emily's sketches, Lavinia's reserve, Tobias's charm, all were threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to unravel. In her room, she opened her notebook, adding to her observations. Colonel Hargrove's searching foundation. Inconsistent stories, likely tied to wartime loot. Scratch on stone, recent, deliberate. Ledger likely hidden nearby, others involved. She closed the book, satisfied with the day's progress. The windmill's sails turned slowly in the night, their shadows weaving patterns of deceit, but Miss Marple knew she was closer to the truth. One thread at a time, she would pull until the whole came. And done. Chapter 4. The widow's secreth moon hung low over St. Mary's Hollow, casting a silver sheen across the windmill's weathered stones. Inside her room at Finch's Folly Guesthouse, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles idle in her lap. The night was still, save for the windmill's soft creak, a sound that seemed to whisper of hidden truths. Her notebook lay open on the desk, its pages filled with observations, the Colonel's probing at the foundation Emily's, cryptic sketches, the metallic clink during the blackout, and the whispered mention of a ledger. Each clue was a piece of a puzzle, but it was Mrs. Lavinia Gray, with her guarded eyes and silent grace, who occupied Miss Marple's thoughts tonight. The widow's subtle movements during the tour, her proximity to the misaligned panel, her fleeting glance at Tobias suggested a role in the windmill's mystery that was more than peripheral. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of unraveling village intrigues, told her that secrets often stirred in the small hours. She slipped her shawl around her shoulders, her sensible shoes silent on the oak floor, and positioned herself by the door, leaving it ajar just enough to hear the creak of the staircase. The guest house was quiet, the other guests presumably asleep, but she sensed the night was far from still. At midnight, a faint sound broke the silence, a soft tread on the stairs, deliberate and measured. Miss Marple eased the door open wider, her eyes adjusting to the dim glow of a single lamp in the hallway. A figure descended, cloaked in shadow, but unmistakable in her elegant poise, Lavinia Gray. The widow wore a dark coat over her nightdress, her movements swift but cautious, as if she knew the house's every groan. Miss Marple waited until Lavinia reached the bottom of the stairs, then followed. Her steps as light as a cat's, Lavinia moved through the common room, bypassing the dying embers of the fire, and slipped into a narrow corridor that led to the windmill's storeroom. Miss Marple paused at the corner, her heart steady, but her senses alert. The storeroom door creaked open, and a faint light, likely a pocket torch, flickered within. She crept closer, her breath shallow, and peered through. The gap in the door, Lavinia knelt by a stack of flour sacks, her torch illuminating a loose floorboard. With practiced ease, she pried it up, revealing a shallow hollow beneath. From her coat, she produced a small parcel, wrapped in oilcloth, and placed it carefully in the hiding spot. She replaced the board, smoothed the dust to conceal her work, and stood, her expression unreadable in the torchlight. Miss Marple memorized the board's location, third from the left, near a crate of old tools, and retreated as Lavinia turned to leave. Back in the corridor, Miss Marple pressed herself against the wall, hidden in the shadows as Lavinia passed. The widow's face was calm, but her hands trembled slightly, betraying a tension she couldn't mask. Once Lavinia's footsteps faded up the stairs, Miss Marple entered the storeroom. Her own torch, a small, practical thing Clara had lent, her casting a narrow beam. She knelt by the floorboard, her fingers probing its edges. It lifted easily, revealing the parcel Lavinia had hidden. With a glance to ensure she was alone, Miss Marple unwrapped the oilcloth. Inside was a folded note, its paper crisp and modern, inscribed with a series of numbers and letters in a neat, precise hand. The 19th of December 47. Meet at dawn. Ridge. Keep it safe. The words were cryptic, but their intent was clear, a rendezvous, likely tied to the ledger. Miss Marple memorized the message, rewrapped the parcel, and returned it to its hiding place. Careful to disturb nothing, she replaced the board, her mind racing with possibilities. Was Lavinia a courier, a conspirator, or something else entirely? And who was she meeting at dawn? She returned to her room, her notebook open before her. She jotted down the note's contents and her observations. Lavinia hid parcel in storeroom, coded note, rendezvous at dawn. Knows windmill's secrets, working with somewhat a bias, ledger likely key. She closed the book, satisfied with the night's discovery, but aware that the note raised more questions than it answered. Sleep would wait. She needed a plan. The next morning, the breakfast table was a study in contrasts. Tobias was his usual charming self, regaling the group with a tale of a local ghost said to haunt the windmill's sails. Emily listened with half an ear, her sketchbook open to a new page filled with intricate lines that resembled the storeroom's layout. Colonel Hargrove, his limp pronounced again, grumbled about the coffee's strength but kept his eyes on the window as if watching the hill beyond. Lavinia, serene as ever, buttered her toast with precision, her gaze never meeting Miss Marple's. Clara, sensing her friend's focus, leaned close. "You were up late, Jane," Find anything, Miss Marple? Smiled, her voice low. A widow with a secret, Clara. Keep your eyes on Mrs. Gray today. She's planning something for Dawn. Clara's eyebrows rose, but she nodded, accustomed to Miss Marple's cryptic directives. The meal ended, and Tobias announced a morning of leisure. Suggesting the guests read or stroll the grounds, Miss Marple seized the opportunity, excusing herself to admire the wild flowers near the windmill's base. In truth, she wanted to observe the ridge mentioned in Lavinia's note alow. Would it rise just beyond the hill, perfect for a clandestine meeting? The ridge was a tangle of brambles and oaks, its crest offering a view of the windmill and the village below. Miss Marple moved carefully, her hat shielding her from the sun, her eyes scanning for signs of disturbance. Near a gnarled tree, she found footprints small, likely a woman's, and fresh. Lavinia had been here, perhaps scouting the spot. A scrap of fabric, dark and fine, caught on a thorn confirmed it. It matched the coat Lavinia had worn last night. Miss Marple pocketed the scrap, her mind turning. The note's mention of Dawn suggested a meeting soon, perhaps tomorrow. She needed to know who Lavinia was meeting and why. Returning to the guest house, she found Emily in the garden, sketching the windmill from a new angle. The girl's pencil moved with purpose, tracing the storeroom's exterior wall with an accuracy that spoke of more than artistic interest. Miss Wells, Miss Marple said, approaching with a smile, your sketches are remarkable. You've a knack for capturing the windmill's character. Emily flushed, closing her book. Thank you, Miss Marple. It's just something to keep me busy. Busy indeed, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but probing. I noticed. You sketching the storeroom. Did your father's stories mention it? He seemed fond of windmills. Emily's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly. He mentioned they were good for hiding things. Smugglers, you know. I just like the idea. Of secrets, Miss Marple nodded, her smile unwavering. Secrets are fascinating, aren't they? Though they're rarely as hidden as people think. Emily looked away, her fingers tightening on her pencil. Miss Marple let the moment pass, satisfied that she'd planted a seed. Emily knew more than she was saying, and her sketches might hold a clue to the ledger's whereabouts. That afternoon, Miss Marple joined Clara for tea in the village, hoping to glean more from Mrs. Pym, the housekeeper, who was known to linger at the tea shop. The shop was a cozy affair, its windows steamed from the kettle, its tables crowded with locals. Mrs. Pym sat in a corner, her eyes bright with gossip as she waved Miss Marple over. Sit, sit, she chirped. I was just telling Mrs. Tate about the windmill. Odd place that. Did you know Lavinia Gray's been seen wandering at night? Near the ridge, they say. Miss Marple's interest sharpened, but she kept her tone light. Wandering? How curious. Perhaps she enjoys the night air. Mrs. Pym snorted. Night air, my foot. She's up to something, mark my words. And Tobias always so charming. But he's cagey about that windmill. Bought it cheap, he did. Then poured money into it. Where's it coming from, I ask. Clara exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, who sipped her tea thoughtfully. A good question. Mrs. Pym, perhaps he's found a treasure in those old stones. Mrs. Pym laughed, but her eyes narrowed. Wouldn't surprise me, that windmills got stories, and not all of them are pretty. Back at the guest house, Miss Marple excused herself to rest, but instead slipped back to the storeroom. The floorboard was undisturbed, but she checked the parcel again. Confirming the note was still there, she replaced it carefully, her mind on the dawn rendezvous. She needed to be there, unseen, to catch Lavinia's accomplice Dot as night fell. The windmill's sails turned slowly, their shadows weaving across the walls. Miss Marple sat by her window, her notebook open, her thoughts on the widow's secret. Lavinia was a key player, but not the only one. The Colonel's tales, Emily's sketches, Tobias's charm all circled the ledger, a record of something valuable enough to draw them all in. She wrote, Lavinia note hidden. Meeting at dawn, ridge footprints hers, accomplice unknown, ledger. Central to all, she closed the book, satisfied with the day's progress. The windmill's whispers were growing clearer, and tomorrow's dawn promised answers. Chapter 5. A village gossip's clue. Morning sun draped St. Mary's Hollow in a golden haze. its rays filtering through the mist that clung to the rolling hills. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped lightly over her shoulders, stepped out of the Windmill guest house with a purposeful air. The village, with its thatched cottages and winding lanes, seemed to hum with the quiet rhythm of rural life. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing. She had decided to visit the heart of the village, the tea shop, a hub of gossip where secrets were traded as freely as scones and clotted cream. If there was a thread to pull in this tangled mystery, she was certain it would be found among the chattering tongues of St. Mary's Hollow. The tea shop, named the Copper Kettle, sat at the corner of the village square, its windows adorned with lace curtains that fluttered in the breeze. A bell tinkled as Miss Marple pushed open the door, greeted by the warm aroma of freshly baked pastries and the low murmur of conversation. The room was cozy, with mismatched chairs and tables covered in gingham cloths. A handful of villagers sat in clusters, their voices rising and falling like a gentle tide. At the counter, a stout woman with rosy cheeks and a flour-dusted apron presided over a gleaming samovar. This, Miss Marple deduced, must be Mrs. Pym, the village's unofficial chronicler of all things noteworthy. "Good morning, dear Mrs. Pym called out, her eyes bright with curiosity as she took in Miss Marple's neat appearance. "You must be Miss Marple, staying up at the Windmill with Clara Henshaw. Come, sit. I've just pulled a tray of lemon drizzle cakes from the oven." Miss Marple smiled, her expression warm but guarded. "How kind of you, Mrs. Pym. I'd love a cup of tea and perhaps a slice of that cake. It smells divine." She settled at a small table near the window, where she could observe both the room and the square outside. Mrs. Pym bustled over with a steaming pot of tea and a generous slice of cake, her movements brisk but her gaze lingering. Miss Marple knew the type, kind-hearted but insatiable for news, the sort who could weave a tale from the smallest thread of fact. She would need to tread carefully, offering just enough to draw out what Mrs. Pym knew without revealing her own suspicions. "The village is charming," Miss Marple began, stirring her tea with deliberate slowness. "But I imagine it's had its share of excitement, especially with that old windmill being turned into a guest house. Mr. Finch must be quite the character to take on such a project." Mrs. Pym's eyes gleamed, and she leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Oh, Tobias Finch. He's a bold one, isn't he? Came to St. Mary's Hollow not 2 years ago, bought that crumbling windmill for a song, and now look at it polished up like a new penny. Mind you, folk round here were mighty surprised. He hadn't 2 shillings to rub together when he arrived, or so they say." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her expression one of polite interest. "Sudden wealth, then. That's intriguing. I suppose he had some fortunate investment or inheritance." Mrs. Pym snorted, wiping her hands on her apron. "Inheritance? My foot. No one knows where his money came from, and he's not one to talk. Keeps to himself, mostly, except when he's charming the guests. But I'll tell you something odd, Miss Marple." She paused for effect, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just before he bought the windmill, there was a stranger skulking about. Tall fellow, dark coat, always wearing a hat pulled low. Seen him near the windmill more than once, and then poof, he was gone. Right around the time Tobias turned up with his pockets full." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around her teacup, but her face remained serene. "A stranger, you say? How curious. Did anyone know who he was?" "Not a soul," Mrs. Pym replied, shaking her head. "Some thought he was a surveyor. Others reckoned he was up to no good. But he was seen talking to Tobias once, out by the old oak on the hill. Looked like they were arguing, though no one heard what about. Next thing we know, Tobias is the proud owner of the windmill, and the stranger's nowhere to be found." Miss Marple took a delicate bite of her cake, her mind racing. A mysterious stranger, a sudden windfall, and a windmill that seemed to draw an unusual assortment of guests. It was a puzzle with too many pieces still missing. "That does sound peculiar," she said, her tone light. "I suppose the windmill itself has its own stories. Old places like that often do." Mrs. Pym nodded vigorously. "Oh, aye. They say it was used during the war, you know. Not just for grinding grain. Mind, there's talk of smugglers, even spies, hiding things in its walls. Never found anything, but folks still whisper about it. Clara Henshaw's been poking around up there, asking questions. She's got a nose for trouble, that one." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Clara's suspicions had brought her here, after all, and it seemed the village shared her unease. "Mrs. Henshaw is a dear friend," she said. "She's mentioned the Windmill's history, but I hadn't heard about smugglers. How fascinating." Mrs. Pym was warming to her theme, her voice growing animated. "Oh, there's more. Old Mr. Grayson, who used to own the windmill before Tobias, swore he heard noises at night, creaking and thumping, like someone was moving heavy things. He was half deaf, mind, so no one paid him much heed. But after Tobias took over, the noises stopped. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" "Indeed it does," Miss Marple murmured, filing away the information. The conversation was proving fruitful, but she sensed Mrs. Pym had more to share if prompted correctly. "I imagine a place like the Copper Kettle hears all sorts of tales. Have any of the windmill's guests been the talk of the village?" Mrs. Pym's eyes widened, and she leaned in so close that Miss Marple could smell the lavender water on her collar. "Well, now that you mention it, that young artist lass Emily has caused a stir, always sketching. She is, and not just flowers or landscapes. I saw her in the square one day, drawing the windmill from all angles, like she was measuring it, with her pencil, and that Colonel Hargrove, charming as he is, he's been asking odd questions about the windmill's foundations. Says he's interested in architecture, but I don't buy it. Then there's Mrs. Gray, the widow, keeps to herself, but I caught her staring at the windmill one night, just standing there in the moonlight like she was waiting for something." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild surprise, though inwardly she was delighted. Mrs. Pym's observations aligned with her own, and the mention of Emily's sketches and the Colonel's inquiries added new layers to the mystery. As for Mrs. Gray, her nocturnal wanderings were already on Miss Marple's radar, but the image of her standing in the moonlight was a vivid clue, suggesting a deeper connection to the windmill's secrets. "You've a keen eye, Mrs. Pym," Miss Marple said, her voice warm with approval. "It's a wonder you don't write a book with all you notice." Mrs. Pym flushed with pleasure. "Oh, go on with you, it's just village talk. But I do like to keep my ears open. You never know what might turn up." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman in a bright red coat, her arms laden with a basket of vegetables. "Morning, Mrs. Pym," she called, setting the basket on the counter. "Brought you those carrots you wanted, fresh from the garden." Mrs. Pym excused herself to attend to the delivery, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to sip her tea and reflect. The stranger, Tobias's sudden wealth, the wartime rumors, and the curious behavior of the guests. It was a tapestry of intrigue, and she was beginning to see the pattern. But she needed more, something tangible to connect the threads. She finished her cake, left a generous tip, and stepped back into the crisp morning air, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The walk back to the windmill was brisk, the path winding, past hedgerows and stone walls. As she approached the guest house, she noticed a faint curl of smoke rising from the chimney, though the day was mild. Curious, she quickened her pace, entering the windmill's common room to find a fire crackling in the hearth. The room was empty, but a pile of ash in the grate caught her eye. Kneeling carefully, she was not as spry as she once was. She sifted through the embers with a poker and found a scrap of paper, partially burned but still legible. It was a photograph, torn in half, showing Tobias Finch standing beside a man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a hat. The background was unmistakably the windmill, its sails stark against a cloudy sky. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was no coincidence. It was the stranger Mrs. Pym had described. She tucked the photograph into her handbag, careful not to smudge the ash, and straightened up, her mind racing. Tobias's connection to this mysterious figure was a vital clue, and the fact that someone had tried to destroy the evidence suggested they knew its significance. But who? The Colonel, with his probing questions, Emily, with her secretive sketches, or Mrs. Gray, whose midnight errands hinted at a hidden agenda? Determined to keep her discovery secret for now, Miss Marple rejoined the guests for lunch, her demeanor as placid as ever. The dining room was lively, with Clara Henshaw bustling about, serving a hearty spread of roast chicken and vegetables. Colonel Hargrove was in fine form, regaling the table with a story about a daring escape during the war. Though Miss Marple noted his eyes darted to her more than once, as if gauging her reaction, Emily sat quietly, picking at her food, her sketchbook nowhere in sight. Mrs. Gray, impeccably dressed in black, offered little to the conversation, her gaze fixed on the window overlooking the windmill's sails. Miss Marple, Clara said, passing her a plate of potatoes, "You were in the village this morning, weren't you? Did you find anything interesting?" "Oh, just the usual village charm," Miss Marple replied, her tone light. "The copper kettle is quite delightful. Mrs. Pym makes a splendid lemon drizzle cake." Clara laughed, but her eyes held a question. She knew Miss Marple well enough to sense there was more to her outing than tea and cake. Miss Marple gave her a reassuring smile, promising to share more later. For now, she was content to observe, letting the guests reveal themselves through their words and silences. As lunch ended, Miss Marple excused herself to her room, claiming a need to rest. In truth, she wanted to examine the photograph more closely. Sitting at the small writing desk, she carefully brushed away the ash, revealing more details. The man in the dark coat held something in his hand, a small book, perhaps a ledger. The image was too damaged to be certain, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions. Tobias Finch was linked to someone outside the village, someone who might hold the key to the windmill's secrets. She leaned back, her mind weaving together the morning's discoveries. Mrs. Pym's gossip had given her a new perspective on Tobias's rise to wealth and the stranger's role in it. The photograph was a tangible link, and the wartime rumors suggested the windmill was more than a quaint guest house. It was a vault for secrets, possibly treasures hidden decades ago. The guests, each with their own peculiarities, were circling the same mystery, whether they knew it or not, and somewhere, in the creaking gears or shadowed corners of the windmill, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill of satisfaction. The puzzle was taking shape, and she was one step closer to unraveling it. She tucked the photograph into a hidden pocket of her knitting bag, resolving to keep it safe until she could connect it to the next piece of the mystery. For now, she would return to the common room, her eyes and ears open, ready to catch the next whisper of deceit in the windmill's shadow. The afternoon passed in a pleasant blur of conversation and tea, but Miss Marple's thoughts never strayed far from the photograph. As she chatted with Clara about the village's history, she kept an eye on the guests, noting their interactions. Emily seemed distracted, her fingers twitching as if longing for her pencil. The Colonel excused himself early, claiming a headache, but Miss Marple caught him glancing at the windmill's base as he left. Mrs. Gray, ever reserved, retired to her room, her footsteps light but purposeful. By evening, the windmill was quiet, its sails still against the darkening sky. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting in hand, her mind as active as ever. The photograph, the stranger, the ledger, each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was not yet complete. She would need to be patient, to listen and watch, to let the truth reveal itself in its own time. For now, she was content with her progress, a small but significant step toward uncovering the deception that lurked in the rustic windmill. As the stars began to speckle the sky, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and made a mental note to speak with Clara tomorrow. Her friend's instincts had been right. There was something amiss in St. Mary's Hollow, and the windmill was at its heart. With a final glance at the silent sails, she turned down her lamp, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. Instead, she sat beside Emily, her knitting in hand. "You have a remarkable eye for detail," she said, her voice kind but probing. "Those sketches of yours, they're almost like blueprints. Are you studying the windmill for a project?" Emily's pencil froze. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she might bolt, but the girl sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's personal," she said quietly. "My father worked on this windmill during the war. He was an engineer, helped repair it when it was damaged. He used to tell me stories about it, said it had secrets. I thought he was just teasing. But before he died, he told me there was something hidden here. A compartment, maybe. I've been trying to find it." Miss Marple's heart softened, but her mind remained sharp. "That sounds terribly important to you," she said gently, "and perhaps a bit daunting, searching alone. Have you found anything?" Yet Emily shook her head, her eyes glistening. Not yet, but I have to keep looking. It's all I have left of him. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. You must miss him terribly. If you'd like, I could help. You look not to pry, of course, but sometimes an extra pair of eyes sees what one misses. Emily's gaze flickered with hope, then doubt. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Oh, my dear, Miss Marple said with a small smile. I've always had a knack for puzzles, and I suspect this windmill's secrets are more than one person can unravel alone. After a long pause, Emily nodded. All right, but please don't tell anyone. Not yet. Of course, Miss Marple promised, her voice as steady as her knitting. Inside, her mind was alight with possibilities. Emily's father, the wartime engineer, had known something about the windmill, perhaps the same secret tied to the ledger. The Colonel's stories, or Mrs. Gray's midnight errands. The sketches were a map, and Miss Marple intended to follow it. That evening, as the guests gathered for dinner, Miss Marple watched Emily closely. The girl was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone. Colonel Hargrove, recovered from his headache, dominated the conversation with tales of his regiment's exploits. But Miss Marple noticed his glances toward Emily, as if gauging her mood. Mrs. Gray, too, seemed on edge, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. After dinner, Miss Marple excused herself early, claiming fatigue, but instead slipped into the windmill's lower chamber where the ancient gears loomed like silent sentinels, armed with Emily's sketches. She studied the area marked possible cavity. The wall was rough stone, its surface unyielding, but she tapped lightly, listening for a hollow sound. Nothing. Yet the precision of Emily's measurements suggested she was close. A soft footstep behind her made her turn. Emily stood in the doorway, her sketchbook clutched tightly. Miss Marple, what are you doing here? Testing a theory, Miss Marple said calmly, holding up the sketch. Your drawings are quite thorough, my dear. The spot here do. You think it's the right place? Emily hesitated, then joined her, pointing to a stone slightly discolored from the rest. I thought it might be here. The measurements line up with what my father described. But I've tried pressing, tapping, nothing works. Miss Marple studied the stone, her fingers tracing its edges. Sometimes, she murmured, the simplest solutions are the most hidden. She pressed firmly, not on the stone, but on a nearby gear, half buried in the wall. A faint click echoed, and the stone shifted, revealing a narrow crevice just wide enough for a small box. Emily gasped. But Miss Marple held up a hand. Not yet, she whispered. We don't know who else is watching. They replaced the stone, agreeing to return at dawn when the guest house was quiet. As they parted, Miss Marple felt a thrill of satisfaction. The windmill's secrets were beginning to yield, and Emily, with her sketches and her father's legacy, was now an ally. The chapter closed with Miss Marple retiring to her room, her knitting untouched as she pondered the crevice's contents. The ledger, the loot, or something else entirely, whatever it was. She was one step closer to the truth, and that, for now, was enough. Chapter 6. The artist's sketchbook. The morning sun filtered through the windmill's narrow windows, casting long, golden beams across the breakfast room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. The air carried the faint scent of fresh bread and lavender, a comforting contrast to the undercurrent of suspicion that had settled over the guest house. Around the table, the guests were a study in contrasts. Colonel Hargrove, his posture ramrod straight, buttered his toast with military precision. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, her eyes shadowed, sipped her tea in silence, and Emily, the young artist, scribbled furiously in a small notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing, though her expression remained one of benign curiosity, as if she were merely observing the habits of village sparrows. Clara Henshaw bustled in, her cheeks flushed from the kitchen's warmth. More scones, anyone? She asked, setting a basket on the table. Her voice was cheerful, but Miss Marple caught the fleeting glance she cast toward Emily, as if the young woman's intensity puzzled her. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already turning over the threads of the mystery that had begun to weave themselves together. The windmill, with its creaking sails and hidden corners, was more than a picturesque relic, it was a puzzle box, and she was determined to find its key. Emily's notebook, Miss Marple noted, was not the sketchbook she had seen her carry during the windmill tour. This one was smaller, leather-bound, its edges worn from frequent handling. The artist's fingers moved with a nervous energy, her pencil scratching out quick, precise lines. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Artists, she knew from her nephew, Raymond's bohemian friends, often revealed more through their work than their words. And Emily, with her quiet demeanor and sudden flushes of unease, was hiding something, perhaps not a crime, but certainly a secret. Miss Marple, Clara said, breaking her reverie, will you join us for a walk to the village later? The market's on today, and there's a lovely stall with handmade lace. Oh, I'd be delighted, Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but her eyes still on Emily. Though I may linger here a bit first. The windmill has such a unique charm, don't you think? One could spend hours studying its details. Emily's pencil paused, just for a moment, before resuming its frantic dance. Miss Marple tucked that observation away, like a stray stitch in her knitting. She finished her tea, excused herself, and made her way to the sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. The room was cozy, its walls lined with faded photographs of the windmill, in its working days, sails spinning against a sepia sky. But it was the small table by the window that drew her attention, where Emily had left her larger sketchbook, its pages slightly askew. Miss Marple hesitated. To pry was not her nature, but to observe was, and observation, she had long ago learned, sometimes required a closer look. With a glance to ensure she was alone, she opened the sketchbook, her fingers light on the worn cover. The pages were filled with drawings of the windmill, its sails, its gears, the curve of its stone walls, but these were no mere landscapes. Each sketch was meticulous, almost technical, with annotations in a neat, hurried script. Measurements marked the distance between gears, the thickness of walls, the angle of a trapdoor she hadn't noticed during the tour. One page showed a cross-section of the windmill's base, with a question mark beside a shaded rectangle labeled possible cavity. Her heart quickened. This was no artist's idle fancy. Emily was searching for something, just as Miss Marple had suspected. The hidden ledger she'd overheard mentioned in Chapter 1 could be connected to this cavity, perhaps concealed within the windmill's ancient structure. But why, and what did Emily know? A creak from the hallway snapped her back to the present. She closed the sketchbook and returned to her chair, picking up her knitting just as Emily entered, her cheeks flushed from the morning chill. The young woman's eyes darted to the sketchbook, then to Miss Marple, who smiled warmly. Such a lovely morning, Emily, Miss Marple said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. Your sketches must be quite something in this light. Do you find the windmill inspiring? Emily hesitated, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. It's unusual, she said finally, the way it's built, I mean. There's so much history in the stones. History, yes, Miss Marple agreed, her needles clicking rhythmically. And secrets, perhaps. Old places like this often hold more than they show. Emily's eyes widened, but she said nothing, retrieving her sketchbook and clutching it to her chest. Miss Marple let the silence hang. Knowing that pressure often unraveled the tightest knots, she decided to change tack, inviting Emily to join her for a stroll later, hoping to build trust. The girl nodded, her expression wary but not hostile, and excused herself to freshen up. Alone again, Miss Marple's mind raced. Emily's sketches suggested a search for a hidden compartment, possibly tied to her late father, a wartime engineer, as Clara had mentioned in passing. The war, Miss Marple mused, had left many scars and many secrets. St. Mary's Hollow, though sleepy now, had been near a strategic airfield during the conflict. Could the windmill have been a hiding place for something valuable? The ledger, perhaps, or something more tangible, like the wartime loot Colonel Hargreaves' stories hinted at. The day passed quietly, with Miss Marple joining Clara and the other guests for the village market. She kept an eye on Emily, who wandered the stalls, but seemed distracted, her gaze often drifting toward the hill where the windmill stood. At one point, Miss Marple caught her speaking to a weary man in a worn coat, his face half hidden by a cap. Their conversation was brief, and Emily looked rattled afterward. Hurrying back to the group, Miss Marple made a mental note to ask Mrs. Pym, the village gossip, about strangers in the area. Back at the windmill, the afternoon light bathed the guest house in a warm glow, but the atmosphere felt heavier. Colonel Hargrove was absent, claiming a headache, and Mrs. Gray had retired to her room. Miss Marple found Emily in the garden, sketching again, this time a detailed rendering of the windmill summit. The page was crowded with notes, access, point, and check for hollow sound. Miss Marple's curiosity burned, but she knew better than to push too soon. Chapter 7. A midnight intraderth windmill stood sentinel against the night, its sails creaking faintly as a restless breeze stirred the darkness of St. Mary's Hollow. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl, sat by her window in the guesthouse's uppermost room, her eyes fixed on the shadowed outline of the ancient structure. The hour was late, well past midnight, and the village had long since surrendered to sleep. Yet Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the knitting needles resting idle in her lap, was wide awake. Her instincts, honed by years of unraveling human secrets, told her that the windmill held more than old gears and dusty beams. It was a stage. And tonight, she sensed, the curtain would rise on a new act. The events of the past days swirled in her mind like leaves caught in an autumn gust. The cryptic conversation about a hidden ledger overheard in the guesthouse parlor. The artist Emily's intense sketches of the windmill's mechanisms. Colonel Hargrove's dubious tales of wartime valor. And Mrs. Lavinia Gray's midnight errand with a coded note all pointed to a web of deception spun around the windmill. Miss Marple had no proof of a crime, not yet, but the threads were there, waiting to be woven into a pattern. Tonight, she resolved to keep watch, her intuition whispering that the windmill's secrets would not stay silent for long. The moon, a thin crescent, cast a pale glow over the hill, illuminating the windmill's weathered stone and the four great sails, motionless now but looming like silent witnesses. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her gaze steady despite the late hour. She had chosen this room deliberately, its window offering a clear view of the windmill's entrance and the narrow path leading up from the village. If anyone approached, she would see them. Her knitting lay untouched, a prop to calm her hands while her mind raced. She thought of her old friend Clara Henshaw, who had summoned her to this quiet corner of England with tales of strange visitors and uneasy feelings. Clara, bless her, had a knack for sensing trouble, even if she couldn't quite name it. Miss Marple trusted that instinct, for it so often mirrored her own. A faint sound broke her reverie, a rustle, not from the wind, but from something more deliberate. She leaned closer to the window, her breath catching as a shadow detached itself from the hedgerow lining the path. A figure, cloaked in darkness, moved with purpose toward the windmill's base. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. This was no guest from the guest house. She knew their silhouettes by now. The colonel's broad shoulders, Emily's slight frame, Lavinia's careful steps. This was someone else, an outsider, and their stealth betrayed intent. She rose, moving with the quiet grace of a woman who knew how to go unnoticed. Her room was dark, the curtains parted just enough to avoid detection. She slipped on her sturdy shoes, grabbed a small torch from her bedside table, and tucked a notebook and pencil into her cardigan pocket. If evidence presented itself, she would record it. Pausing at the door, she considered waking Clara but decided against it. Clara was no night owl, and besides, Miss Marple preferred to observe alone for now. She could summon help later if needed. The guest house was silent as she crept down the stairs, avoiding the creaky third step from the bottom. The front door, mercifully, was well oiled, and she slipped outside into the cool night air. The windmill loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the starry sky. The figure had vanished, likely inside the windmill's base, where a heavy wooden door guarded the entrance to the grinding room. Miss Marple moved swiftly, keeping to the shadows of the garden wall, her torch unlit to preserve her cover. She had no intention of confronting the intruder, not yet, but she needed to see what they were after. The windmill's door was ajar, a sliver of darkness within. Miss Marple paused, listening. A faint scraping sound, like metal on stone, echoed from inside. Her mind raced through possibilities, A thief, perhaps, or someone connected to the ledger. The wartime cash or the coded note. She edged closer, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. The door's hinges groaned as she nudged it open, just enough to peer inside. The grinding room was a cavern of shadows, lit only by faint moonlight filtering through high, narrow windows. The massive millstones, silent now, dominated the space, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of grain. The air smelled of dust and old wood, tinged with something sharper, oil, perhaps, or metal. Miss Marple's eyes adjusted to the dimness, and she spotted the intruder near the far wall, crouched beside a low trapdoor set into the floor. The figure wore a dark coat and a cap pulled low, obscuring their face. They worked with urgency, prying at the trapdoor with a small crowbar. The source of the scraping she'd heard. Miss Marple's mind catalogued details. The intruder's build was slight, not tall, suggesting agility over strength. The crowbars glint caught the moonlight, and she noted fresh scratches around the trapdoor's edges, marks of recent tampering. This was no random trespasser. They knew exactly where to look. She considered her options. A shout would alert the guest house, but it might also send the intruder fleeing before she could learn more. Instead, she slipped behind a stack of empty grain sacks, her small frame hidden in their folds, and watched the intruder muttered under their breath, words too low to catch, and gave the trapdoor a final heave. It resisted, locked tight. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A locked trapdoor suggested something worth hiding, and she recalled Emily's sketches of the windmill's mechanisms. Had the artist known about this? Or was this the Colonel's wartime secret? Or perhaps Lavinia's coded rendezvous point? The intruder pulled something from their pocket, a small object, metallic, glinting faintly, a key. Miss Marple realized, her pulse quickening. But before they could use it, a sharp crack echoed from outside, like a branch snapping underfoot. The intruder froze, head whipping toward the door. Miss Marple held her breath, her own senses on high alert. Had someone else followed? The intruder hesitated, then pocketed the key and bolted for the door, moving with the speed of someone practiced in escape. Miss Marple waited until their footsteps faded down the path, then emerged from her hiding place. She approached the trapdoor, her torch casting a narrow beam over the scratched wood. The lock was old but sturdy, and the keyhole bore the same fresh marks as the edges. Whatever lay beneath was important enough to risk a midnight break-in. She knelt, her knees protesting slightly, and examined the trapdoor closely. The scratches were deep, some older than others, suggesting multiple attempts over time. She traced the lock with her finger, noting its unusual shape, ornate, almost decorative, unlike the windmill's utilitarian fittings. Her mind flashed to the coded note Lavinia had hidden, the mention of a delivery at dawn. Was this trapdoor the delivery point, and who was the intruder? Someone working with Lavinia, or against her? A second crack from outside snapped her attention back to the present. She doused her torch and retreated to the shadows, her heart steady, but her senses sharp. Footsteps approached, slower this time, deliberate. Miss Marple's hand closed around the pencil in her pocket. A poor weapon, but better than nothing. The door creaked open, and a familiar figure stepped into the moonlight. Clara Henshaw, her nightgown peeking out beneath a hastily thrown-on coat, a rolling pin clutched in one hand. "Jane," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "I saw you leave the house. What's happening?" Miss Marple stepped into view, raising a finger to her lips. "Hush, Clara. We've had a visitor." She gestured toward the trapdoor. "Someone was trying to get in there, but they've gone for now." Clara's eyes widened, her grip tightening on the rolling pin. "A thief, or one of those guests you've been watching?" "I don't know yet," Miss Marple admitted, her tone calm but firm. "But they left something behind." She led Clara to the trapdoor, pointing out the scratches and the lock's odd design. "We need to secure this place and keep watch. Until morning. Whoever they were, they'll be back." Clara nodded, her fear giving way to determination. "I'll fetch the constable. He's slow, but he'll come. And I'll bring my brother's old shotgun just in case." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Clara's courage, like her gossip, was understated but reliable. "Good. But first, help me look around." They dropped something in their haste. The two women searched the grinding room, their torches casting flickering beams over the millstones and beams. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a glint near the trapdoor, a small object, half buried in the dust. She knelt again, brushing away the dirt to reveal a key, its handle engraved with a peculiar symbol, a crescent moon entwined with a thorn vine. She held it up, turning it in the light. It was no ordinary key, and its craftsmanship suggested age and purpose. "Clara, have you ever seen this symbol before?" Miss Marple asked, passing the key to her friend. Clara squinted, her brow furrowing. "Not exactly, but it's like something from the old stories. The windmill was built by a merchant family. The Thorns, centuries ago, they had a crest moon. And vines, I think. Folks said they hid their wealth during hard times. Could this be theirs?" Miss Marple tucked the key into her pocket, her mind racing. A family crest, a hidden trapdoor, a wartime cache, pieces of a puzzle, but not yet. A picture. "It's possible," she said, "but we need to know what's under that trapdoor. For now, let's lock the windmill and keep this between us. No need to alarm the guests, not yet." Clara agreed, and they secured the door with a spare padlock. From the guesthouse shed, as they returned to the house, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. The intruder's key was a prize, but it raised new questions. Was the intruder one of the guests, disguised, or an outsider, as Clara's gossip had suggested? And what lay beneath the trapdoor art, as the Colonel's stories implied? Or something else entirely? Back in her room, Miss Marple sat at the small desk, her notebook open. She sketched the symbol from memory, her pencil moving with precision. Below it, she jotted down her observations: the intruder's slight build, the crowbar's marks, the trapdoor's lock, the key's design. She added a note about Clara's mention of the Thorn family, wondering if village records might hold more clues. The ledger, the cache, the note all seemed to converge on the windmill's base, but the intruder's identity remained a shadow dot as dawn approached. The first light touched the windmill's sails, casting long shadows across the hill. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her mind alight with possibilities. She felt the familiar thrill of a mystery deepening, each clue a step closer to the truth. The intruder had escaped, but they'd left a trail, and Miss Marple was not one to let a trail go cold. She leaned back, her eyes on the windmill, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The night had been eventful, and she was content with her progress. The key in her pocket was a tangible link to the windmill's secrets, and she would not rest until she unlocked them all. The chapter closed with the village stirring to life, unaware of the drama that had unfolded under the moon's watchful eye. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, prepared for the day ahead, knowing the windmill's whisper was growing louder, and she was ready to listen. Chapter 8. Decoding the past. The morning sun cast long, golden fingers through the windmill's narrow windows, painting the dusty wooden floor with stripes of light. Miss Jane Marple sat at the small oak table in her room at the guest house, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue scarf. The rhythm of the needles was a familiar comfort, but her mind was far from idle. In her lap lay the coded note she had retrieved from beneath the storeroom floorboard, its cryptic symbols taunting her with their secrets. She adjusted her spectacles, her sharp eyes tracing the inked lines as she murmured to herself, "A puzzle is only as strong as its weakest link, and I dare say we're close to finding it." The note, penned in Lavinia Gray's precise hand, was a cipher of some complexity. But Miss Marple was no stranger to such challenges. During the war, she had dabbled in amateur code-breaking for a local auxiliary group, deciphering messages for the Home Guard with a knack that surprised even herself. Now, as she studied the note, she recognized the pattern as a variation of a substitution cipher, likely rooted in wartime practices. The symbol's odd combinations of dots, dashes, and half-circles suggested a key tied to something specific, perhaps a phrase or a physical object within the windmill itself. She rose, tucking the note into her pocket, and glanced out the window. The windmill's sails turned lazily in the breeze, their creaks blending with the distant chatter of sparrows below. The village of St. Mary's Hollow bustled quietly, unaware of the secrets hidden in the ancient structure on the hill. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the windmill summit, where the sails met the tower in a tangle of weathered beams. The note had mentioned a rendezvous at the summit, and she felt a prickle of anticipation. Whatever was hidden there, someone had already disturbed it, leaving only dust in their wake. But who and what had they taken? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple. Came a hesitant voice. It was Emily, the young artist, her auburn hair tied back in a loose braid, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple had grown fond of the girl, whose earnestness reminded her of her own niece, though Emily's nervous energy hinted at deeper burdens. "Come in, dear," Miss Marple said warmly, setting her knitting aside. "You're up early. I trust you slept well." Emily stepped inside, clutching her sketchbook. "Not really," she admitted, her voice low. "I keep thinking about what you found that note. It's got to mean something, hasn't it?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression gentle but probing. "Oh, it means a great deal, I suspect. But meaning is like a skein of wool tangled until you find the right thread to pull. Would you care to help me unravel it?" Emily's eyes brightened, and she nodded eagerly. "I'd like that. I think I might know something that could help." Miss Marple gestured to a chair, and Emily sat, her sketchbook resting on her lap like a shield. "Go on, then," Miss Marple prompted, her tone encouraging. "What's on your mind?" Emily hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. "It's about my father," she said at last. "He was an engineer during the war, worked on all sorts of secret projects. He used to tell me stories about hidden places, compartments, caches, things like that. Once, when I was little, he mentioned the windmill here in St. Mary's Hollow, said it was more than it seemed, but he never explained what he meant. I thought it was just a story, but now," Miss Marple leaned forward, her interest piqued. "Your father spoke of this windmill specifically." Emily nodded. "He said it had a secret, something hidden during the war. I didn't think much of it until I came here and saw the windmill for myself. My sketches, they're not just drawings. I've been trying to map out its structure, to see if I could find what he was talking about." Miss Marple's mind raced. Emily's father, an engineer with wartime secrets, tied to the windmill. The ledger, the coded note, the colonel's tales of hidden loot, it was all beginning to weave together, though the pattern was still incomplete. "That's very helpful, Emily," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I believe your father's secret is at the heart of this mystery, and I think this note," she patted her pocket, "may lead us to it. Shall we try to crack it together?" Emily's face lit up, and she opened her sketchbook, revealing pages filled with meticulous drawings of the windmill's gears, beams, and stone walls. Some sketches were annotated with measurements, others with question marks where hidden spaces might lie. Miss Marple admired the girl's precision, noting how her artistic eye had captured details even the windmill's owner, Tobias Finch, might have overlooked. "The note mentions a rendezvous at the summit," Miss Marple said, spreading the paper on the table, "but it's written in a cipher. I suspect it's a substitution code, where each symbol stands for a letter. The trick is finding the key, something your father might have known." Emily studied the note, her brow furrowing. "Father used to play code games with me," she said. "He'd write messages in patterns, based on things around us, like the number of windows in a room, or the letters in a book's title. Could it be something like that?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Very likely, my dear. Let's start with the windmill itself. How many sails does it have?" "4," Emily replied instantly. "And the beams at the summit, how many cross the main structure?" Emily flipped to a sketch of the windmill's top. 6 main beams, plus 2 smaller ones for support. Miss Marple nodded, her mind working. "For sails, 8 beams. Perhaps they ascertain the number of letters in the key phrase. The windmill's summit is a logical place to start. Let's go there now. I'd like to see these beams for myself." The two women left the guest house and climbed the winding path to the windmill, the morning air crisp and scented with wildflowers. The structure loomed above them, its stone walls weathered but sturdy, the sails casting slow shadows across the hill. Inside, the air was cool and musty, the scent of old wood and grain lingering in the shadows. Tobias Finch was nowhere to be seen, likely tending to his dubious business elsewhere, which suited Miss Marple just fine. She preferred to investigate. Without his watchful eyes, they ascended the narrow spiral staircase to the summit. where the windmill's mechanism dominated the space, a complex array of gears and beams that turned the sails. The wooden beams creaked faintly, their surfaces scarred with age. Miss Marple counted them carefully. 6 main beams, as Emily had said, plus 2 smaller ones, 8 in total. She ran her fingers along one, noting its rough texture, and peered into the shadows where the beams met the stone wall. The dust was disturbed, as she'd noticed before, but now she saw something else, a faint carving in the wood, a series of notches that looked deliberate. "Emily, look at this," she called softly. Emily joined her, squinting at the marks. "It's not just wear and tear," Miss Marple said. "These are intentional. Count them." Emily traced the notches with her finger. 8, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "Just like the beams." Miss Marple nodded. "I suspect your father left this as a clue. 8 notches, 8 beams, 8 letters. Let's try a key phrase with 8 letters. Something tied to the windmill or the war." Emily's eyes widened. "What about windmill itself? WINDMILL. 8 letters." Miss Marple smiled. "Clever girl. Let's test it." Back in her room, they sat with the note, mapping each symbol to a letter based on the word windmill. The cipher was a simple substitution, with each symbol corresponding to a letter in the key phrase, repeated as needed. After some trial and error, the message emerged: "Meet at Summit Dawn tomorrow, cache behind 3rd beam." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A cache," she murmured, "just as your father said. But someone's been here already." The dust was disturbed. "We need to check that 3rd beam." They returned to the windmill, this time with a small flashlight Emily had brought. The summit was dim, the narrow windows admitting only slivers of light. Miss Marple counted the beams carefully, stopping at the 3rd. It was thick, its base bolted to the stone wall, but there was a slight gap where it met the floor. Emily knelt, shining the light into the crevice. "There's something here," she whispered. "A hollow space, but it's empty." Miss Marple crouched beside her, her knees protesting, but her curiosity overriding the discomfort. The space was indeed empty, save for a faint outline in the dust where an object had once rested. "Someone beat us to it," she said, her voice steady despite her disappointment. "But they didn't cover their tracks well. Look, there's a scrape here, fresh wood exposed. Whoever took the cache was in a hurry." Emily's face fell. "So it's gone, whatever father hid." "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, standing and brushing dust from her skirt. "They took something, but they may not have found everything. Your father was clever. He might have left more than one hiding place, and this note suggests a rendezvous tomorrow at dawn. If we're there, we might catch our thief." Emily's eyes lit up with determination. "Then we'll be there. But what do you think they took?" Miss Marple's mind turned to Colonel Hargreaves' stories of wartime loot, stolen art, perhaps, or documents tied to it. "Something valuable enough to draw people here decades later," she said. "The ledger we've heard about, perhaps, or something it points to. Art, jewels, even secrets from the war. Whatever it is, it's worth hiding and worth stealing." The rest of the day passed in quiet preparation. Miss Marple and Emily pored over the sketchbook, searching for other clues in the windmill's structure. They found nothing definitive, but Emily's diagrams suggested another possible hiding spot near the windmill's base, where the foundation stones were uneven. Miss Marple filed this away, her instincts telling her the windmill held more secrets yet. That evening, they joined the other guests for dinner in the guesthouse's cozy dining room. Colonel Hargrove was in high spirits, spinning another tale of his military days, while Lavinia Gray sat silently, her eyes darting to the window. Tobias Finch bustled about, playing the genial host, but Miss Marple noticed his hands tremble slightly as he poured the wine. She said little, her mind on the dawn rendezvous, her fingers itching to knit as she pieced together the puzzle. After dinner, she and Emily retreated to her room, where they planned their next move. "We'll need to be discreet," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "Whoever's coming at dawn won't expect company. We'll hide near the summit, out of sight but close enough to see who arrives." Emily nodded, her jaw set. "I want to know what father was involved in. If there's anything left to find, I want it to be us who finds it." Miss Marple smiled, her heart warmed by the girl's resolve. "We will, my dear, and we'll do it together. As night fell, Miss Marple lay awake, her mind turning over the clues, the ledger, the wartime cash, the coded note, the disturbed dust. The windmill was a vault of secrets, its beams and stones hiding truths from decades past. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing she was closing in on the cache's location, even if someone else had reached it first. The rendezvous at dawn would reveal more, perhaps the thief, perhaps their motives. As the windmill's sails creaked outside, she drifted to sleep, her dreams filled with gears and shadows, and the promise of truth waiting in the morning light. Chapter 9. The Colonel's confession. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's room at the Windmill guest house, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak floor. She sat at the small writing desk, her knitting needles idle for once, as she turned over the events of the past days in her mind. The windmill's secrets were unraveling, but not quickly enough for her liking. The coded note from Lavinia, the artist Emily's cryptic sketches, and the shadowy intruder at the trapdoor all pointed to a hidden truth, one that seemed to coil tighter with each passing hour. But it was Colonel Hargrove, with his polished anecdotes and guarded glances, who occupied her thoughts now. His stories of wartime valor had a sheen of rehearsal, and Miss Marple was certain he knew more about the windmill's mysteries than he let on. She adjusted her spectacles and glanced at the torn photograph she'd retrieved from the fireplace, now carefully tucked into her notebook. The image showed Tobias Finch, the windmill's owner, shaking hands with a man whose face was half obscured by fire damage. The stranger's posture, rigid and formal, suggested a military bearing, perhaps a connection to the Colonel. Miss Marple's lips pursed. "People always reveal themselves," she murmured, "if you give them enough rope." A soft knock interrupted her musings. Clara Henshaw, her friend and hostess, peered in, her face a mix of concern and curiosity. "Jane, are you joining us for breakfast? The Colonel's already holding court downstairs, and Emily looks like she hasn't slept a wink." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I'll be down shortly, Clara. I just need a moment to organize my thoughts." Clara nodded, though her eyes lingered on the notebook. "You're up to something, aren't you?" "I can always tell when you get that look." "Merely observing," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "It's what old ladies do best." Clara chuckled and left, closing the door softly. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her cardigan, and tucked the notebook into her handbag. Breakfast would be the perfect opportunity to test her suspicions about the Colonel. People, she knew, were most careless when they thought themselves in control. The dining room was a cozy affair, with a long oak table set with mismatched china and a vase of wildflowers Clara had picked from the hill. The windmill's stone walls gave the room a cool, cavernous feel, despite the warmth of the morning. Colonel Hargrove sat at the head, his silver hair gleaming under the chandelier, regaling the table with a story about a daring escape from a German outpost. His voice boomed with practiced charm, but Miss Marple noticed how his eyes flicked to the others, gauging their reactions. Emily, the young artist, sat across from him, her sketchbook closed tightly in her lap. Her fingers fidgeted with a pencil, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Mrs. Lavinia Gray, the widow, sipped her tea in silence, her expression unreadable behind a delicate porcelain cup. Tobias Finch bustled in with a tray of scones, his jovial smile as fixed as ever. Miss Marple took her seat beside Clara, her gaze moving from one guest to another, cataloging every gesture. "And there I was," the Colonel was saying, "crawling through the mud with nothing but a bayonet. And my wits. The Jerrys were close enough I could hear their boots crunching. But I knew that old barn was my only chance." "Fascinating," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but cutting through the tale like a knife through butter. "You must have been in many such barns during the war, Colonel. Hiding places seem to be a specialty of yours." The table stilled. The Colonel's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered with a hearty laugh. "Oh, Miss Marple, you make it sound so cloak and dagger, just a soldier doing his duty." "Of course," she said, buttering a scone with deliberate care. "But it's curious, isn't it, how certain places like barns, or perhaps windmills, seem to hold onto their secrets, almost as if they're waiting for the right person to come looking." Emily's pencil snapped in her hand. the sound sharp in the quiet. All eyes turned to her, but she quickly tucked the broken pieces into her pocket. "Sorry," she mumbled. "Clumsy." Lavinia set her cup down with a faint clink. "Some secrets are better left buried. Don't you think, Miss Marple?" Her voice was smooth, but there was a challenge in her dark eyes. Miss Marple met her gaze, unruffled. "Oh, I don't know, Mrs. Gray. In my experience, secrets have a way of digging themselves up, especially when they involve something valuable." Tobias coughed, nearly dropping the teapot. "More tea, anyone?" he asked, too loudly. Clara shot Miss Marple a questioning look, but Miss Marple only smiled and took a dainty bite of her scone. After breakfast, the guests dispersed, but Miss Marple lingered, watching the Colonel linger by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He was studying the windmill's sails, now still in the morning calm. With an intensity that belied his casual demeanor, she approached, her steps soft on the rug. "Colonel Hargrove," she said, "might I have a word?" He turned, his smile automatic. "Of course, Miss Marple, always a pleasure." She gestured to a pair of armchairs by the fireplace, now cold and swept clean. "I've been thinking about your stories," she began, settling into the chair with the air of someone discussing the weather. "They're quite vivid, but there's one detail that puzzles me." "Oh." He sat opposite her, crossing one leg over the other. "And what's that?" "Your regiment," she said. "You mentioned serving in the Low Countries near Antwerp. In '44, a dangerous time, with so much opportunity, shall we say, for things to go missing. Valuables, perhaps, hidden in unlikely places." The Colonel's face remained pleasant, but his fingers tightened on the armrest. "War's a chaotic business, Miss Marple. Things get lost, found, lost again." "I don't follow your meaning." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright. "I think you do. Colonel, a windmill, for instance, might be just the place to hide. Something valuable, something like a cache of stolen art, perhaps, tucked away by a regiment that knew the war was turning against them." The air between them seemed to thicken. The Colonel's smile vanished, and for a moment, he looked every one of his 70 years tired, wary, and cornered. "That's a bold accusation," he said quietly. "You've no proof." "Not an accusation," Miss Marple corrected, her voice mild. "An observation. I've seen many men like you, Colonel. Men who carry a secret like a stone in their shoe. It wears on them, makes them restless. You've been circling this windmill like a moth around a flame. Why?" He stared at her, his jaw working as if chewing on his next words. Then, to her surprise, he slumped back in the chair, rubbing a hand across his face. "You're a sharp one, aren't you?" he muttered. "Sharper than I gave you credit for." Miss Marple said nothing, letting the silence do its work. She'd learned long ago that people filled silences with truths they hadn't meant to share. "It was a lifetime ago," he began, his voice low. "The war, it wasn't all heroics and medals. My regiment, we were in retreat, cut off near Antwerp. We stumbled on a cache paintings, sculptures, old masters, looted by the Nazis from a museum in Brussels. We couldn't let the Germans have it back, but we couldn't carry it either. So we hid it in a windmill, much like this one." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but she kept her tone gentle. "And you hid it well, I presume?" He nodded, staring at the floor. "Too well. After the war, I went back, but the windmill had been damaged, half collapsed. I thought the cache was lost forever. Then I heard about this place, St. Mary's Hollow, and Tobias Finch buying an old windmill. The description matched too closely to be coincidence. I had to see for myself. And, have you found it?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not yet, but I know it's here. I can feel it. Those paintings, they're not just art, Miss Marple. They're history, family's legacies. I told myself I'd return them, make things right. But the longer I kept quiet, the harder it got. If word got out I'd been part of hiding them." He trailed off, his face ashen. Miss Marple studied him, her mind racing. His confession was genuine. She was certain, but it raised new questions. Was he truly seeking redemption? Or was he protecting his own reputation? And how did Tobias Finch fit into this? The photograph suggested a connection, one she hadn't yet unraveled. "I believe you want to do the right thing," she said carefully. "But secrets like this attract others, Colonel, others who might not share your noble intentions. Help me, and I'll help you keep this quiet for now." His eyes met hers, searching for a trap. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "Access," she said, "to the windmill's lower levels, where no one's supposed to go, and your word that you'll tell me everything you find, no matter how small." He hesitated, then extended a hand. "You have it." Miss Marple shook his hand, her grip surprisingly firm for such a frail-looking woman. "Good. Now, let's be discreet. There are others watching, and I'd rather they didn't know we're working together." The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine. Miss Marple joined Clara for a walk through the village, chatting about inconsequential things while her mind pieced together the puzzle. The Colonel's confession had given her a motive, but it also complicated matters. If the cash was real, who else knew about it? Lavinia's coded note suggested she was involved, and Emily's sketches pointed to a hidden compartment. Tobias, too, was no innocent bystander. His sudden wealth and the stranger in the photograph were too convenient to ignore. That evening, Miss Marple slipped away from the guest house and met the Colonel at the windmill's base. The night was cool, the air heavy with the scent of damp grass. The windmill loomed above them, its sails creaking faintly in the breeze. The Colonel carried a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. "There's a locked door in the cellar," he whispered. "I've seen Tobias go down there, but he keeps it bolted." Miss Marple produced the key she'd found after the intruder's escape, its peculiar symbol glinting in the moonlight. "Will this help?" His eyes widened. "Where did you get that?" "Never mind that," she said. "Will it open the door?" He nodded, and they descended the narrow stone steps into the windmill cellar. The air was musty, thick with the smell of old grain and damp stone. The Colonel's flashlight swept across shelves of dusty jars and rusted tools, until it landed on a heavy iron door set into the far wall. Miss Marple handed him the key, and with a grating screech, the lock turned. Inside was a small chamber, its walls lined with wooden panels. The Colonel ran his hands over them, searching for a catch or seam. Miss Marple watched, her eyes catching a faint irregularity in the wood, a panel slightly misaligned. She pressed it, and with a soft click, it slid open, revealing a narrow recess. Inside was a single object, a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. The Colonel reached for it, but Miss Marple was faster, slipping it into her handbag. "We'll examine it together," she said firmly. "Somewhere safer." He looked ready to argue, but the sound of footsteps above made them both freeze. The Colonel doused the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. The footsteps paused, then moved away, but Miss Marple's heart raced. Someone else was in the windmill, and they weren't alone. Back in her room, Miss Marple and the Colonel pored over the book by lamplight. It was a ledger, its entries written in a precise, faded hand. Names, dates, and descriptions of artworks filled the pages. Paintings by Dutch masters, sculptures from French estates, all looted during the war. The final entry listed the windmill as the hiding place, with a note, to be retrieved when safer. "This is it," the Colonel whispered. "Proof the cache exists. But where are the paintings?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Hidden, Colonel, just as you hid them, but someone else is looking, and they're closer than we are." She closed the ledger, her mind already turning to the next step. The Colonel's confession had given her a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was far from complete. Lavinia, Tobias, the intruder, each was a thread in a tangled web, and Miss Marple was determined to untangle it. For now, she was content with her progress, the ledger a solid step toward the truth. But as she looked at the Colonel's weary face, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Chapter 10. A trap at Donth Windmill's shadow stretched long and thin across the dew-soaked grass of St. Mary's Hollow, its sails creaking faintly in the pre-dawn breeze. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window in the guest house, her knitting needles clicking softly, though her hands moved more from habit than intent. Her eyes, sharp as ever despite the hour, were fixed on the windmill's silhouette. Where the first hints of light brushed the horizon, the coded note she'd deciphered in Chapter 8 burned in her mind. A rendezvous at the windmill's summit, set for dawn. She had no intention of letting the moment pass. Emily, the young artist, sat across from her, nervously twisting a strand of her dark hair. Her sketchbook lay open on the table, its pages filled with intricate diagrams of the windmills, gears now repurposed as a map for their plan. Miss Marple had enlisted Emily's help after their search at the summit yielded only dust and questions. The girl's earnestness, coupled with her father's wartime connection to the windmill, made her a natural ally. But more than that, Miss Marple saw in Emily a spark of courage waiting to be kindled. "Are you sure this will work, Miss Marple?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of the windmill. "What if they don't come, Miss?" Marple's needles paused, and she offered a reassuring smile. "My dear, people with secrets are predictable in one way. They cannot resist the bait of their own desires. The ledger, real or not, will draw them out. We've only to wait." The ledger in question was a clever forgery, crafted by Emily under Miss Marple's guidance. They'd spent the previous evening in Clara Henshaw's cluttered parlor, where Emily's artistic skill transformed a blank notebook into a convincing replica of the hidden ledger mentioned in whispers throughout the guest house. Its pages were filled with fabricated lists of wartime artifacts, dates, and coded symbols, all designed to lure the conspirators into revealing themselves. The real ledger, if it existed, remained hidden, but Miss Marple was banking on the culprit's greed to betray them. The plan was simple yet bold. Place the fake ledger at the windmill summit, where the coded note had directed the rendezvous, and wait for the guilty party to claim it. Miss Marple had chosen the summit for its isolation, accessible only by a narrow spiral staircase. It offered no easy escape. She and Emily would hide in the shadows of the gear room below, ready to confront whoever appeared. Clara, ever loyal, had been tasked with keeping the other guests occupied at breakfast, ensuring no interruptions. As the sky shifted from indigo to pale gold, Miss Marple folded her knitting and rose. "Come, Emily. We mustn't be late for our own trap." They slipped out of the guest house, moving silently across the damp grass. The windmill loomed ahead, its weathered stone glowing faintly in the dawn light. Emily carried the fake ledger, wrapped in a cloth to mimic a secretive package, her hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple, in her sensible coat and hat, moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had unraveled many a knot in human nature. Inside the windmill, the air was cool and musty, smelling of old wood and iron. The spiral staircase creaked under their steps, but Miss Marple's measured pace kept their ascent discreet. At the summit, a small platform overlooked the village, framed by the windmill's massive sails, which turned lazily in the breeze. Emily placed the ledger on a wooden ledge near the central shaft, arranging it to look carelessly abandoned. Then they descended to the gear room, where the windmill's ancient machinery offered ample hiding spots among its shadowed beams and cogs. They crouched behind a rusted gear, the size of a cartwheel, its teeth glinting faintly in the slivers of light filtering through the shutters. Emily's breathing was quick, and Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Steady, my dear. We're merely observers for now. Let them make the first move." Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The only sounds the rhythmic groan of the windmill and the occasional chirp of waking birds. Then a faint creak echoed from the staircase. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her senses attuned to the smallest shift in the air. Emily gripped her sketchbook, her knuckles white. A figure emerged at the summit, moving cautiously. The dim light obscured their face, but the silhouette was unmistakable, slender, cloaked in a dark shawl. Mrs. Lavinia Gray. The widow's movements were deliberate, her head turning as if expecting an ambush. She approached the ledger, her gloved hands hesitating before snatching it from the ledge. She unwrapped the cloth, flipping through the pages with growing agitation. "She's taken the bait," Miss Marple whispered, her voice barely a breath. "But we must wait. She's not alone in this." As if on cue, another set of footsteps echoed up the staircase, heavier, less cautious. Tobias Finch, the windmill's owner, appeared, his jovial demeanor replaced by a tense scowl. His eyes darted to Lavinia, who clutched the ledger to her chest. "Is that it?" Tobias demanded, his voice low but sharp. "You're sure it's the real one?" Lavinia's lips tightened. "It matches the description. But we weren't supposed to meet here, Tobias. You said dawn at the river. I changed my mind," he snapped, Too many eyes in the village. This is safer. Miss Marple's mind raced. Tobias's sudden change of plan suggested distrust, perhaps a fracture in their partnership. She noted Lavinia's stiff posture, the way her fingers tightened around the ledger. Greed, fear, or betrayal. Something was about to break. Lavinia opened the ledger again, her eyes scanning the pages. These lists, they're detailed. Paintings, gold, even a statue. If this is true, we're set for life. Tobias stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. If it's true, you're too trusting, Lavinia. That old woman's been poking around. She's not as harmless as she looks. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. She'd always found it amusing how the guilty underestimated her, mistaking her age for frailty. Beside her, Emily stifled a gasp, but Miss Marple's steady gaze kept her calm. Lavinia's voice turned cold. You're paranoid, Tobias. Marple's just a nosy spinster. She doesn't know anything, doesn't she? Tobias's tone was mocking. Then why's she been asking about the windmill's history? About wartime caches? I saw her with that artist girl, whispering like conspirators. Miss Marple felt a pang of pride for her role in unsettling them. But the conversation was veering dangerously close to exposure. She needed to act before Tobias's suspicions derailed their trap. She signaled Emily with a subtle nod, and the girl, catching her cue, knocked a small wrench against the gear. The metallic clang echoed through the room, sharp and deliberate. Lavinia froze, the ledger slipping from her hands. Tobias spun toward the sound, his hand reaching for something in his coat pocket. Who's there? He barked. Miss Marple stepped from the shadows, her expression serene, but her voice firm. Good morning, Mr. Finch, Mrs. Gray. I see you've found my little gift. Lavinia's face paled, her eyes darting between Miss Marple and the ledger now lying on the floor. Tobias's hand froze, his fingers brushing what Miss Marple suspected was a small pistol. She kept her gaze steady, her demeanor unshaken. A gift, Tobias said, forcing a laugh. You're up early, Miss Marple. Couldn't sleep. Oh, I sleep quite well, thank you, she replied, her tone light but piercing. But I find early mornings are the best time to catch those who prefer the shadows. That ledger, for instance, it's quite convincing, isn't it? Lavinia's composure cracked. You made this? It's a fake. Miss Marple inclined her head. A necessary deception, I'm afraid. You see, I've been curious about your late-night activities, Mrs. Gray, and you, Mr. Finch, seem remarkably interested in this windmill's secrets for a man who claims to be a simple innkeeper. Tobias's eyes narrowed, his hands still hovering near his pocket. You're meddling in things you don't understand, old woman. Walk away, and we'll forget this happened. Emily stepped forward, her voice trembling, but resolute. She's not alone, Mr. Finch, and we know about the art, the stolen paintings hidden here during the war. My father worked on this windmill. He told me about the compartment. Tobias's face darkened, but Lavinia let out a bitter laugh. Your father, that drunk engineer, he was a fool, dreaming of riches he'd never find. This ledger is our ticket, Tobias, not hers. Miss Marple seized the moment of discord. Mrs. Gray, you seem to believe Mr. Finch is your partner in this venture. But I wonder, has he told you about the stranger he met last week? The one Mrs. Pym saw near the windmill. Lavinia's head snapped toward Tobias. What stranger? You said we were keeping this quiet. Tobias's jaw tightened. She's bluffing, Lavinia. Don't listen to her. But Miss Marple pressed on, her voice calm but relentless. A man in a gray coat, seen lurking near the windmill's base. I found a photograph in the fireplace, partially burned, but it showed you, Mr. Finch, with someone who wasn't a guest, perhaps a buyer for your stolen art. The air grew thick with tension. Lavinia's eyes blazed with betrayal. You were cutting me out, weren't you? After all my work decoding the notes, finding the summit. Tobias's hand moved to his pocket, but Miss Marple was faster. She stepped forward, her walking stick raised not as a weapon, but as a distraction. I wouldn't do that, Mr. Finch. The village constable is already on his way. Thanks to Mrs. Henshaw, you've nowhere to run. As if summoned by her words, the sound of boots echoed up the staircase. Tobias lunged for the ledger, but Emily was quicker. Snatching it from the floor, and retreating behind Miss Marple. Lavinia, caught between fury and fear, made a desperate grab for Tobias's arm, pulling him off balance. The scuffle was brief but chaotic. Tobias shoved Lavinia aside, his pistol now in hand, but before he could aim, the constable burst onto the platform, followed by Clara and two burly villagers. "Drop it, Finch." The constable barked, his own weapon drawn. Tobias hesitated, his eyes wild, then let the pistol fall with a clatter. Lavinia sank to her knees, sobbing, the fake ledger still clutched in Emily's hands. Miss Marple stepped back, her heart steady despite the chaos, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. The trap had worked perhaps too well. As the constable bound Tobias's wrists, Lavinia's sobs turned to accusations. It was all his idea. He said the art was untraceable, that we'd sell it and disappear. I only followed his lead. Tobias sneered, his charm long gone. You were greedy as I was, Lavinia. Don't play the victim now. Miss Marple watched them, her mind already piecing together the next steps. Lavinia's confession was a start, but Tobias's escape was a loose end. She turned to Emily, who stood clutching the ledger, her face pale but triumphant. "Well done, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "You were braver than you know." Emily managed a shaky smile. I wanted to make my father proud, to find what he left behind. And we will," Miss Marple promised, her eyes drifting to the trapdoor they'd yet to open. "But first, let's ensure these to face the consequences of their greed." As the constable led Tobias and Lavinia down the staircase, Clara approached, her face a mix of relief and awe. "Jane, you're a marvel. How did you know they'd fall for it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "People, Clara, are much like my knitting. Pull the right thread, and the whole pattern unravels. Now, let's have some tea. I suspect we've earned it." The dawn broke fully over St. Mary's Hollow, bathing the windmill in golden light. Miss Marple lingered a moment, her gaze on the sails which turned with a steady, unbroken rhythm. The trap had succeeded, but the real ledger and the windmill's deeper secrets still waited. She felt a quiet thrill at the thought, her curiosity as sharp as ever. Chapter 11. The hidden compartment windmill stood sentinel over St. Mary's Hollow, its sails catching the first light of dawn as Miss Jane Marple stood at its base. The key from the midnight intruder clutched in her gloved hand, its peculiar symbol a crescent moon pierced by a dagger gleamed faintly, as if whispering of secrets long buried. Beside her, Emily, the young artist, shifted nervously, her eyes darting between the windmill's weathered stones and the horizon, where a thin mist clung to the hills. The air was crisp, charged with the promise of revelation, and Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning, and today, she was certain, they would uncover the heart of the windmill's mystery. "Miss Marple," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the creak of the sails. "Are you sure this is the right moment? What if Tobias comes back?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a reassuring smile, though her eyes remained sharp, scanning the path leading to the village. "My dear, Tobias is likely licking his wounds after last night's debacle, but we must be swift. The key you see here," she held it up, letting the sunlight catch its edges, "is our invitation to the truth, and I suspect it will lead us to the ledger you've been seeking." Emily nodded, her hands tightening around the strap of her satchel. She had confessed to Miss Marple the previous evening, after Lavinia's arrest, that her father's wartime stories had mentioned a hidden compartment in the windmill, a place where secrets were stowed during the chaos of conflict. The coded note, the colonel's confession, and now this key all pointed to a cache that had drawn deceit like moths to a flame. Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing through human nature's fog, sensed they were on the cusp of uncovering. The windmill's heavy oak door groaned as they pushed it open, revealing the cool, shadowy interior. The air smelled of old wood and damp stone, with a faint metallic tang that reminded Miss Marple of the clink she'd heard during the power outage days ago. The ground floor was quiet, the guests still abed after the previous night's excitement, and Clara Henshaw had promised to keep watch at the guest house, ensuring no one disturbed their search. Miss Marple led the way to the narrow staircase that spiraled downward to the windmill's base, where the trapdoor awaited. The basement was a cavernous space, its walls lined with ancient millstones and rusted gears. A single lantern hung from a beam, casting long shadows that danced like specters. The trapdoor, set into the floor near the far wall, was unassuming a square of weathered wood, its edges scarred from the intruder's recent attempt to pry it open. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting slightly, and examined the lock. It was old but sturdy, its keyhole shaped to match the peculiar design of their key. "Here we are," she murmured, inserting the key with a steady hand. It turned with a satisfying click, and the trapdoor gave a low groan as she lifted it, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. A rickety ladder, its rungs worn smooth by time, led downward, and a faint draft carried the scent of earth and something else, parchment, perhaps, or paint. Emily's breath caught. "It's real," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and apprehension. "My father said it was hidden where the windmill's heart beats. I thought he meant the gears. But this must be it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing through the clues they'd gathered. The ledger mentioned in whispers, the wartime cash Colonel Hargrove sought, Lavinia's coded note, and now this hidden compartment. "Let us proceed with care," she said, lighting a second lantern from her bag. "Truth is often guarded by shadows." They descended the ladder, Miss Marple first, her movements deliberate despite her age. The shaft was narrow, its walls rough-hewn stone, and the air grew colder as they went. At the bottom, they found a small chamber, no larger than a pantry, its walls damp and moss-streaked. In the center stood a wooden chest, its surface carved with the same crescent-tan dagger symbol as the key. Dust coated its lid, but fresh scratches suggested someone had been here recently, perhaps the intruder, or even Tobias himself. Emily's eyes widened as she knelt beside the chest. "This is it," she whispered, tracing the symbol with a trembling finger. "My father worked on this windmill during the war. He said they hid something here, something that could rewrite history if it fell into the wrong hands." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, but her heart quickened. "Then let us see what history has to say." She handed Emily the key, sensing the girl's need to connect with her father's legacy. Emily inserted it into the chest's lock, and, with a soft click, the lid sprang open, releasing a puff of stale air. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, lay a leather-bound ledger, its edges frayed but intact. Beside it was a small canvas, no larger than a book, wrapped in oilcloth. Miss Marple lifted the ledger first, its weight reassuring in her hands. She opened it, revealing pages filled with meticulous handwriting, lists of names, dates, and locations, interspersed with sketches of paintings and artifacts. The entries detailed a cache of looted art, hidden by Colonel Hargrove's regiment during the war, with notes on their origins, a Dutch master from a bombed-out gallery, a Renaissance miniature from a private collection, a Byzantine icon spirited away from a crumbling church. "This is the ledger," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but triumphant. "It's more than a record, it's a confession. These artifacts were stolen, hidden here to avoid detection, and someone, perhaps Tobias, perhaps Lavinia, intended to profit from them." Emily unwrapped the canvas, revealing a small painting of a woman in a crimson gown, her eyes luminous against a dark background. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "My father mentioned a painting like this. He said it was the key to everything, but he never explained why." Miss Marple studied the painting, her mind piecing together the puzzle. "This is no ordinary work," she said. "The detail, the style, it's a Vermeer, or a very clever copy. Its value lies not just in its beauty, but in what it represents. Proof of the cache's existence. Whoever controlled this painting controlled the ledger's secrets." As they examined their find, a faint noise echoed from above a creak, followed by the soft thud of footsteps. Miss Marple's hand tightened on the ledger, and she gestured for Emily to be silent. "We have company," she whispered, extinguishing the lantern. The chamber plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow filtering down the shaft. The footsteps grew louder, pausing at the trapdoor. A voice, low and urgent, muttered something indistinguishable, followed by the scrape of metal. Miss Marple's heart pounded, but her mind remained clear. She whispered to Emily, "Stay close, and be ready to move. We must protect what we've found." They pressed against the wall, the ledger and painting clutched tightly. The trapdoor, creaked open and a beam of light swept the shaft, revealing a figure descending the ladder. It was not Tobias, as Miss Marple had feared, but a man she didn't recognize at all. With a gaunt face and a dark coat, his movements cautious but purposeful. The stranger from Mrs. Pym's gossip, she realized, her mind flashing to the torn photograph in her knitting bag. "Who's there?" the man called, his voice sharp with suspicion. He reached the chamber floor, his lantern casting wild shadows. Miss Marple stepped forward, her demeanor calm despite the tension. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "I'm afraid you've caught us at a rather private moment. Might I ask what brings you to this hidden corner of the windmill?" The man froze, his eyes narrowing as he took in Miss Marple's unassuming figure and Emily's nervous stance. "You're the old lady poking around," he said, his tone laced with disdain. "I don't know how you found this place, but you're in over your head. Hand over the chest's contents, and I'll let you walk away." Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her mind was racing. This man, likely the stranger who'd argued with Tobias, was no mere opportunist. His familiarity with the chamber suggested he knew its secrets intimately. "I'm afraid I can't do that," she said. "These items belong to history, not to those who would exploit them. But perhaps you'd care to explain your interest. I'm a very good listener." The man's lip curled, and he took a step forward, his hand slipping into his coat pocket. "You're meddling in things you don't understand, old woman. That ledger's worth more than your life." Before he could act, Emily lunged forward, swinging her satchel at his lantern. The glass shattered, plunging the chamber into darkness. A scuffle ensued, the man cursing as Miss Marple grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her toward the ladder. "Up, quickly," she hissed, her voice urgent, but composed. They scrambled up the shaft, the man's footsteps pounding behind them. As they reached the basement, Miss Marple slammed the trapdoor shut, jamming the key in the lock to slow their pursuer. They raced up the stairs to the common room, where Clara stood waiting, her face pale with alarm. "Jane, what's happened?" Clara cried, catching sight of their disheveled state. "No time," Miss Marple panted, thrusting the ledger and painting into Clara's hands. "Hide these in your room, under the floorboard by the hearth. We've been found out." Clara nodded, dashing off as the trapdoor below shuddered under a heavy blow. Miss Marple turned to Emily, her eyes bright with determination. "We need to delay him. Help me move that table." Together, they dragged a heavy oak table across the basement door. Barricading it, the pounding grew louder, accompanied by muffled shouts, but the door held for now. Miss Marple's mind raced, calculating their next move. The stranger's presence confirmed her suspicions. The ledger and painting were the keys to a larger scheme, one that Tobias and Lavinia had only partially revealed. "We need the constable," Miss Marple said, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Emily, run to the village and fetch him. Tell him it's urgent, a matter of theft and possible violence. I'll stay here and keep our friend occupied." Emily hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "But what if he gets through? You can't face him alone." Miss Marple's smile was almost mischievous. "My dear, I've faced worse than an angry man in a dark coat. Go, and be quick." Emily nodded, bolting out the door into the morning light. Miss Marple turned back to the barricaded door, her heart steady despite the danger. She had the ledger's secrets in her grasp, and she would not let them slip away. As the pounding continued, she scanned the room for anything useful: a poker by the hearth, a coil of rope from the windmills, gears. Her eyes fell on a small brass bell, used to summon guests for meals. An idea formed. Simple but effective, she rang the bell loudly, its chime echoing through the windmill. Moments later, Colonel Hargrove appeared at the top of the stairs, his face flushed with concern. "Miss Marple, what's the racket? Is something wrong?" "Quite wrong, Colonel," she said, her tone brisk. "There's an intruder in the basement, and I need your assistance. He's after something valuable, and I believe you know what it is." The Colonel's eyes flickered, but he nodded, his military bearing taking over. "Right. I'll fetch my old service revolver from my room. Stay here." As he hurried off, Miss Marple positioned herself near the barricaded door, listening to the stranger's efforts to break through. She felt a pang of unease. Hargrove's involvement was a gamble, given his own interest in the cash, but she needed his strength. Moments later, he returned, revolver in hand, his expression grim. "Who's down there?" he demanded, taking up a position beside her. "A man connected to Tobias Finch," Miss Marple replied. "He wants what we found, a ledger and a painting, hidden in a compartment below. I suspect he's part of the scheme you mentioned." Colonel Hargrave's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. His eyes fixed on the door. The pounding stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, with a splintering crash, the trapdoor gave way, and the stranger emerged, his coat torn and his face contorted with rage. He froze at the sight of Hargrave's revolver. "Stop right there," Hargrave barked, his voice steady. "Drop whatever you're holding and put your hands up." The stranger hesitated, then raised his hands, a small knife glinting in one. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he snarled. "That ledger's my ticket out of this mess. Tobias promised me a cut, and I'm not leaving without it." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "You're too late. I'm afraid. The ledger is safe, and the authorities are on their way. But I'm curious why risk so much for it. What did Tobias promise you?" The man's eyes darted between her and Hargrave. Calculating his odds, Tobias said the art was worth millions. He muttered. "He needed me to find the compartment, said I'd get half, but he double-crossed me, just like he did Lavinia. I came to take what's mine." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the final pieces together. Tobias had orchestrated a scheme to profit from the wartime cash, using Lavinia and this stranger as pawns, but his greed had unraveled it. Before she could press further, the sound of boots on the path announced the constable's arrival. With Emily in tow, Miss Marple, the constable called, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor. "What's this about an intruder?" She gestured to the stranger, who stood deflated under Hargrave's watchful eye. This gentleman was attempting to steal valuable evidence from a hidden compartment in the windmill. "I suggest you take him into custody and contact the authorities in London. The ledger and painting we've found are linked to wartime thefts, and they'll want to examine them." The constable nodded, cuffing the stranger with practiced efficiency. As he was led away, Miss Marple turned to Hargrave, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Colonel. Your assistance was timely, but I trust you understand the importance of what we've found. It's not yours to claim." Hargrave met her gaze, a flicker of shame in his eyes. "I know, Miss Marple. I meant what I said. I want the art returned to its owners. I'll cooperate, whatever it takes." She nodded, satisfied for now. With the stranger detained and the ledger safe, she felt a surge of triumph. Tempered by the knowledge that Tobias was still at large, Clara emerged from her room, the ledger and painting in hand, her face a mix of relief and awe. "Jane, you've done it," she said, her voice trembling. This is extraordinary." "Not quite done," Miss Marple replied, her eyes on the windmill's sails, now turning slowly in the breeze. "Tobias is still out there, and he won't give up easily. But we have the truth in our hands, and that's a powerful weapon." As the constable took statements, and the guests gathered, drawn by the commotion, Miss Marple slipped the key back into her pocket, its symbol a reminder of the secrets they'd uncovered. The windmill, once a vault for deceit, was yielding its truths, and she was determined to see the mystery through to its end. For now, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, knowing the ledger and painting were safe, and the net was tightening around Tobias Finch. Chapter 12. Tobias's Gambith windmill loomed over St. Mary's Hollow like a sentinel, its sails still under the bruised sky of early evening. As if the world itself were holding its breath, Miss Jane Marple sat in the guest house's small parlor, her knitting needles idle for once, her gaze fixed on the distant silhouette of the windmill. The ledger and painting, secured in Chapter 11, were now locked in a safe at the village constabulary, but Tobias Finch remained at large, a shadow slipping through her carefully laid plans. Lavinia Gray's confession had unraveled part of the schema plot to sell looted wartime art. But Tobias, the windmill's enigmatic owner, was the linchpin. Miss Marple knew he would not vanish quietly. Men like him, she reflected, were driven by greed and desperation, a volatile mix that made them both predictable and perilous. The parlor was quiet, save for the soft crackle of the fire, Clara Henshaw was in the kitchen, preparing tea, while Emily, the young artist, sat across from Miss Marple, sketching absently. Colonel Hargrove had retired early, claiming fatigue. Though Miss Marple suspected he was avoiding her questions, the air felt heavy, charged with the tension of a storm about to break. She had seen it before in St. Mary Mead moments when secrets, like overripe fruit, could no longer stay hidden. A sharp knock at the front door startled Emily, her pencil skittering across the page. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but her voice was calm. "Clara, dear, would you see who that is?" She called, her tone as mild as if she were asking for another biscuit. Clara bustled in, wiping her hands on her apron, and opened the door. A man stood there, his face half hidden by a scarf, his hat pulled low. "Evening, Mrs. Henshaw," he said, his voice smooth but edged with urgency. "I need to speak with Miss Marple. It's urgent." Miss Marple rose, her heart quickening but her expression serene. "Do come in," she said, gesturing to a chair. As the man stepped into the light, she recognized him instantly. Tobias Finch, his jovial mask replaced by a gaunt, hunted look. His coat was rumpled, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. Emily gasped softly, but Miss Marple's steady gaze silenced her. "Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, settling back into her chair. "I wondered when you'd return. You've been rather elusive since our last encounter." Tobias hesitated, glancing at Emily, then back to Miss Marple. "I'm not here to play games," he said, his voice low. "You have something I need. The ledger, the painting. Hand them over and I'll be gone. No trouble for anyone." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes bright with quiet amusement. "And if I refuse?" "You've already lost Mrs. Gray's assistance, and the authorities are quite interested in you. What makes you think you can bargain now?" Tobias's hand slipped into his coat pocket, and Miss Marple caught the faint outline of something metallic. Not a gun, she thought, too small, but perhaps a knife. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Threats, Mr. Finch. How very unwise. You see, I've found that secrets, once uncovered, are difficult to bury again." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a hiss. "You don't understand what's at stake. That ledger, it's not just about art. It's names, dates, deals, people who'd kill to keep it hidden. Give it to me, and I'll make it worth your while. Money, safety, name your price." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unyielding. "My price, Mr. Finch, is the truth, and I suspect you're not here to offer that. You're here because you're afraid of what's in that ledger and who it might expose." Clara, who had been hovering by the door, stepped forward, her face pale. "Jane, should I fetch the constable?" Tobias's eyes flicked to her, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought he might lunge. Instead, he pulled a small envelope from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. "Open it," he said. "Go on, see what you're dealing with." Miss Marple, with deliberate calm, picked up the envelope. Inside was a photograph, not the torn one from Chapter 5, but a new one, showing a group of men in wartime uniforms, standing before the windmill. One face was circled in red ink, unmistakably Tobias's, though younger, his expression grim. A note was scrawled on the back: "The windmill holds more than art. Destroy it, or they come for you." "Who are they?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but piercing. Tobias's jaw tightened. "People you don't want to meet. Old debts. From the war. The ledger names them, men who profited from chaos, who'd do anything to stay in the shadows. I was just a courier then, moving their goods. The windmill was our drop point. I thought I could cash in now, but they've found me." Miss Marple's mind raced. The ledger's significance deepened, a record not just of looted art, but of a wartime network, perhaps still active. Tobias's fear was genuine, but his greed had led him to this moment. She folded the photograph and slipped it into her pocket. "You thought you could sell the art and keep the ledger as leverage," she said. "But you underestimated your partners, and me." Before Tobias could respond, a crash echoed from the windmill, followed by a faint orange glow. Emily leapt to her feet, her sketchbook falling to the floor. "Fire!" she cried, pointing to the window. Miss Marple's heart sank. Tobias's eyes widened, not with surprise, but with resignation. "They're here," he muttered, bolting for the door. Miss Marple grabbed Clara's arm. "Get the constable, now, and rouse the others." "We must save the windmill." Clara nodded, sprinting toward the village, while Emily hesitated, her face torn between fear and determination. "Miss Marple, I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm. "My father's secrets are in there. I won't let them burn." Miss Marple nodded, her admiration for the girl's courage tempered by urgency. They hurried to the windmill, the glow intensifying as they approached. Smoke curled from the base, where the trapdoor from Chapter 11 stood open, flames licking at the wooden beams. Miss Marple's mind flashed to Tobias's satchel. Had he planted something earlier? Or were his mysterious they already at work? Inside, the air was thick with heat and the acrid scent of burning wood. Miss Marple coughed, pulling her shawl over her face while Emily scanned the chamber. "The gears," she shouted, pointing to the ancient machinery, now wreathed in flames. "If they collapse, the whole structure could go." Miss Marple's eyes darted to the trapdoor. The hidden compartment was empty now, its contents safe. But the fire threatened to destroy the windmill's history and any remaining clues. She spotted a bucket of water by the wall, likely left from a cleaning, and handed it to Emily. "Start there," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We'll do what we can until help arrives." As Emily doused the flames, Miss Marple searched for Tobias. He hadn't fled far. She found him near the windmill's summit, wrestling with a metal canister, its contents spilling onto the stone floor. "Kerosene," she realized, her stomach twisting. "Mr. Finch," she called, her voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. "This is madness. You'll destroy everything and yourself." Tobias turned, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wild. "You don't get it," he snarled. "If I don't burn it, they'll kill me. The ledger's gone. But the windmill's proof. They'll never stop." Miss Marple stepped closer, her small frame unyielding. "And you think burning it will save you? You're not just destroying evidence, Tobias, you're destroying a village's heart. Help me stop this, and I'll speak for you. There's still a chance for redemption." For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. Then a shout from below broke the spell. Sergeant Barrow, followed by Clara and a handful of villagers, wielding buckets and blankets. Tobias hesitated, then dropped the canister, its contents splashing harmlessly onto the stone. "It's too late," he muttered, sinking to his knees. Miss Marple didn't pause. She directed the villagers, her voice calm but authoritative. Organizing a chain to douse the flames, Emily worked tirelessly, her sketches forgotten as she fought to save her father's legacy. The fire, confined to the lower chamber, was subdued. After a tense hour, leaving the windmill scorched but standing, Sergeant Barrow cuffed Tobias, who offered no resistance. "Who started it?" the constable demanded, his lantern illuminating Tobias's defeated face. "They did," Tobias said, his voice hollow. "I don't know their names. They found me this morning. Said the windmill had to go. I tried to bargain, but..." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And you thought you could still profit by retrieving the ledger first," she said. "But you've given us something more valuable, confirmation of a larger scheme. The authorities will want to hear about your friends." As Tobias was led away, Miss Marple turned to Emily, who stood by the trapdoor, her face smudged with soot but her eyes bright. "It's safe," she said softly. "My father's work, it's safe." Miss Marple smiled, her heart light despite the night's ordeal. "And so is the truth, my dear. You've done him proud." The next morning, the village buzzed with news of Tobias's arrest and the fire's defeat. Miss Marple met with Sergeant Barrow, handing over the ledger, the painting, and the photograph Tobias had given her. "These will need to go to the proper authorities," she said. "I suspect the names in that ledger will lead to more than just stolen art." Colonel Hargrove, shaken by the night's events, approached her later, his face lined with remorse. "I should have come clean sooner," he said. "I'll testify, Miss Marple, about the art, the regiment, everything. It's time to set things right." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but firm. "Redemption is a choice, Colonel. You've made a good one." Emily, meanwhile, decided to stay in St. Mary's Hollow, inspired to paint the windmill's story not as a place of secrets, but as a symbol of resilience. Clara, ever practical, began plans to restore the damaged chamber, envisioning the windmill as a community center where the village could gather. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, She stood by the windmill one last time, its sails catching the morning light. The mystery was solved, the truth uncovered, and the village safe. She boarded the train to St. Mary Mead, her knitting in her lap, her mind already turning to the next puzzle life might bring. The windmill, scarred but standing, was a testament to the power of truth and to the quiet strength of an old lady who never underestimated the human heart.